Pepper's mother called him and asked if he'd left the milk jug outside. The boy shouted to his mother that he'd taken out everything from large dishes to plates. She looked at him and said that now a lot of rainwater would collect. The young boy smiled and threw himself into his mother's arms. He asked why they were collecting water. She looked closely at all the dishes outside and said that this wasn't just water. She said that these were fairy drops in which fairies were born. Pepper was surprised and asked his mother if fairies were born in rainwater. The woman looked at her son and stroked his head. She said it was true. A fairy was born in a place where enough magical water collected. The forest fairy is born in the water, stingy, in an old tree, is found in a puddle, in a crevice. Between the rocks and in the flowing river, the water fairy is born. She looked at her son and said, "That's why this water is called fairy tale." The young man was surprised. Peter looked at his mother and asked her with a smile if they were collecting rainwater to make a fairy. His mother looked at him and said that, unfortunately, humans are incapable of creating a fairy, and they were collecting this water to use as medicine. The young man was surprised. He and his mother stared intently at the raindrops, only those fairies who wished for them to appear in this world, the dark domain of destruction. These dark domains are called destruction. Their existence hinders people's happiness. People live very bright and wonderful lives. But if destruction expands, everyone will become unhappy. One must be strong to fight against death. But the darkness is very powerful, deadly and merciless. She knew that, like the darkness, she could bring about her own destruction. And she liked it. In the dark dungeon, she would become the strongest darkness. Looking around, she couldn't tell where she was. She saw a dark, narrow room. But the earth was leading her here. She knew it didn't matter because it was dark enough here to become darkness. But in the midst of all the darkness, she saw a little boy. She didn't understand who he was. She couldn't understand what the little boy was doing in such a cramped space. She noticed that the young man was tied up. Everyone else laughed happily. She couldn't understand why the boy had such a devastated expression. She thought he probably just had no soul. A man burst into the cell where the boy was being held. He attacked him angrily and told him to stop fiddling around and that I would be out soon. The young man was frightened and surprised. The man shouted at the young boy to follow him. She couldn't understand why the man was acting so rudely towards the child. She couldn't believe the little boy was locked in such a place, since there was nothing there to make him smile. She thought that perhaps today had been a particularly bad day, and with this thought, she watched him for several days. She saw that every day he was called somewhere. After the boy was locked up with little food. After the time had passed, the boy was taken outside again. But still, the boy stared at her endlessly, as if afraid she would disappear. She knew, in truth, that he was constantly trembling with fear. The boy looked at her, and in his loneliness and sadness, she wondered if he could feel emotions. She genuinely wanted to make the boy smile. She wanted to show him the happiness people experienced outside these walls. She hoped she could show him the beauty of the outside world. She wanted to show the beauty of a magnificent city or village, or a friendly family visible outside the window. But she knew it would be difficult for her to do such a thing alone. Something she could handle alone. Something that could only be felt by seeing its simplest beauty. She wanted to become his flower. The little boy saw a bright glow and was surprised. He saw in the midst of the dark dungeon a beautiful flower of unearthly beauty. A moment later, he saw that there was someone in the flower. A beautiful fairy was looking at him from the flower. The young man was surprised. He hadn't expected anything like this. The little fairy flew closer to him and greeted him. The fairy kissed the boy and said that she really wanted to meet him. She looked at him and said with a smile that she was very glad to meet such a small person. She said that she was a flower fairy. She looked at him and said that all this time she had accumulated a lot of questions. She asked him where they were and how they got there. She was surprised that he didn't say anything. She asked him how old he was and what his name was. The flower fairy was eager for the young man to answer her quickly. She said with a smile that she was a fairy who had just been born and that she, too, did not know many things. The young man looked at her intently and attentively. He was taken aback and didn't know what to say to her. The young fairy looked at him intently and asked in a trembling voice if he was really cooking. She saw that he looked at least 6 years old, but she was puzzled by his inability to speak. It's natural for people that age to speak. She wondered if the great people here hadn't taught him to speak. She realized he hadn't even been taught words. She didn't know why they dragged him out of the dungeon every day. The flower fairy looked at him intently and did not like the whole situation. She wanted to teach him to talk. She said that when he learns to talk, they will be able to tell each other interesting stories. She said that she has stories that she really wants to share with him. The flower fairy smiled and said she was there and really wanted to talk to him. She looked at him and asked him to answer yes. She was curious if he could say a simple yes. The flower fairy looked at him and said with a smile that she really wanted to be friends with him. The young boy was surprised. He stared at the fairy, and the fairy looked back at him with a smile. In the blink of an eye, the boy plucked the flower. A moment later, he caught the young fairy in his hand. She was surprised and didn't understand what was happening. The fairy was surprised by the little man's actions. She frantically begged him to wait, as she wanted him not to hurt her. A man entered their cell and angrily flung the door open. He looked at the boy and told him to hurry up and come out. The man saw that the boy was hiding something. The man approached the boy and asked what kind of grass it was. He was furious. The man looked at the young man and asked what he had just eaten. He was furious. The boy stared at the guard. The guard glared at him and asked if he could even hear him. The little fairy was shocked that the boy had just swallowed her. She said she was having trouble breathing and wanted to get out, frantically begging him to let her go. The guard looked away from the young man and sighed with a grin. A moment later, he hit the boy and asked if he was going to fight back. The boy took the guard's blow. A moment later, he fell to the ground with a crash. The fairy, in turn, screamed. She was surprised and asked the boy what it was. In a trembling voice, she asked if the guard hit him. She said she couldn't believe it, since the boy had done nothing wrong to deserve the blow. The young fairy asked why the man had done such a thing to him. The man looked at the boy with a contemptuous gaze and showered him with insults. He saw the remains of the flower and asked with disdain whether the boy had really eaten the grass. The guard came closer to the boy and angrily told the boy to spit out the possessed thing. The man was furious and did not understand how the boy could ignore him. He angrily kicked the boy again, this time in the stomach. The man frantically shouted at him that he would explain everything now if he didn't understand the first time. The man shouted at the boy to spit it all out. The flower fairy was shocked by everything that was happening and felt very sorry for the little boy. She couldn't understand how a man could bully an innocent boy like that. The man mocked the boy. The fairy frantically begged the boy to let her go, as no human would be able to see her. She said in a trembling voice that people who weren't allowed wouldn't be able to see the fairy. The man, in turn, screamed furiously and continued to tell the boy to spit it out. The fairy was in shock. She felt very sorry for the boy since he was being beaten unfairly. She whispered pitifully, "Enough." A moment later, she burst into tears, wanting all the boy's suffering to end. A moment later, the boy spat out the contents. The guard saw the remains of the flower on his hand. He stared at the boy for a few minutes, but then turned and left. The fairy looked at the boy lying there beaten and asked in a trembling voice if he had done it to protect her. She looked at him and asked if he had considered that if a man saw her, he would lose her. She looked at him and cried. She said that he was a stupid fool, as she had said earlier that only the person she allowed could see her. She looked at him intently and said that she could leave. But a moment later, wiping away her tears, she asked him for forgiveness and said that he was the bravest child in the world. The fairy looked at him and said that she would certainly teach him to speak, as she really wanted to be friends with him. She looked at him and said that he should speak up, not hit him when someone does it. She said that he should use words like beautiful and delicious, and also the word like. The fairy looked at him intently and said that she hoped that after training, he would like her. She looked at him and asked if he would say that he liked her. A young fairy showed a beautiful flower to a boy. The fairy asked him if he liked it. Since this was the flower she was born in, she looked at him and, smiling, told him to repeat after her and said, "Flower." The young boy made an incomprehensible sound. The fairy was frightened by him. She was puzzled and told him to repeat what she told him first. She looked at him and told him to say the word flower. A moment later, he tried to say the word flower, but it came out a little differently. But still, the fairy was very glad that he made a mistake in the word and changed only one letter. She smiled and said he'd done it almost perfectly, though she knew his pronunciation needed some work. She said that if he kept it up, he'd be able to pronounce words like her. The fairy flew closer to him and, smiling, said he was a very smart little boy. She looked at him and said with a smile that now he could try it because there was honey in the flower. The young man looked at her with surprise and bewilderment. The fairy looked at him and asked if it was tasty and sweet. The boy was shocked. The young fairy smiled and asked if she should begin teaching him the word delicious. She knew it was a taste only he knew. The fairy smiled and said that even among many flower fairies, she was endemic, and only he knew about this flower. Even only he could taste this honey. The boy looked at her in bewilderment. She looked at him and asked if he wanted to know if there were more. She flew closer to him and asked for forgiveness. since the power of a fairy is limited, and she could not use it in large quantities at one time, since she was still a very small fairy. She smiled and said that the power of a fairy is called Vit-A. This is the meaning with which a fairy is born. The idea of herself and the world appeared in her head at birth. For example, a hare is an animal with elongated ears, or that young creatures need love and attention. She looked at him and said that perhaps today it was too early to tell about this to a child who barely understood one word. She looked at him intently and did not understand why he could not receive this unconditional love, with such shining eyes and a beautiful voice. She didn't like all of this. The little boy recognized the fairy immediately. And thanks to him, the fairy exists in this world. He was her sweet first human. The fairy saw that people were torturing the boy, and she was furiously angry at them and wanted to make them all regret it. She thought maybe she should have become a fairy of darkness. The boy said the word honey with a smile. The young fairy was very glad that he was able to pronounce the word, and she looked at him with a smile. She looked at him with a smile and said he had pronounced it correctly. She was surprised when he smiled a moment later and said the word flower. The young fairy flew closer to him and kissed him on the cheek. She smiled and said that he had pronounced everything correctly. The fairy said that the boy needed to learn one word at a time like this, but the most important thing for her was his smile. The young fairy enjoyed his smile. She realized she had made the right choice after all and become a flower fairy. The first word she taught him was flower. She was grateful that she could show him a beautiful flower. She was very happy. The fairy looked at him with a smile and said that she wanted to teach him a lot of things, and she remembered what they needed most. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that they needed names. The boy looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. The fairy said that neither of them had names. The fairy said she would find a beautiful name that would suit him, but that would come a little later. Yawning and stretching, she said she was starting to feel sleepy. The young fairy smiled and said she would go to bed. As the younger the fairy, the more sleep she needed. She looked at him and said he probably wouldn't understand what she was talking about. The young fairy saw that he began to close his palms. The fairy sat more comfortably on his palm and asked the little man if he was one of those people who hide everything. She knew, however, that this was a completely different feeling from the one she had experienced when he swallowed her. In this silence, she heard the boy's breathing, peaceful and soft. She thought she should have said goodnight to him after all. She thought she could try teaching him how to say hello tomorrow. The fairy felt the warmth emanating from his warm hands. Her peaceful, quiet sleep was interrupted. She woke up and didn't see the boy. She looked around the room in surprise and confusion as he was nowhere to be found. She realized that soon I had taken the whole little boy, that big man who had beaten him earlier. She was furious because she couldn't allow this to happen again. She saw a door the child couldn't pass through willingly. But for her, the door presented no problem, for the same reason that man didn't see her. Until a fairy acknowledges something, it has no effect on her. Even if it was an inanimate object, the young fairy walked through the door with ease. Flying through the door, she saw simply a staircase that led upstairs. She was surprised because she realized that the little boy was locked on the very bottom floor. They were in room number 4. She knew that there was no one in the other rooms, but as soon as she climbed the stairs and went through another door, more than 100 doors appeared before her eyes. And behind these doors, she heard frantic sobbing and suffering. The fairy walked through the door and saw a crying child. He was devastated. Many of the children muttered in alarm. However, there were even more who lay with empty eyes like her new friend. If he hadn't met the fairy, he might have become like them. She looked at the children and wondered why little people were in such a place. She couldn't understand what crime they had committed. Looking closely at the child, she saw that he had a number, just like everyone else. But she was still puzzled by the fact that her new friend didn't have a number. She understood that he was locked in such a place for some other reason. She'd previously thought this was a very strange place, but after what she saw, she was convinced. The fairy decided to continue up the stairs. Sometime later, the fairy was breathing heavily as she was extremely tired. She didn't understand where she was, as it seemed to her like a prison labyrinth. The higher she climbed, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. People wearing dark clothes were walking around, and they resembled the man who had beaten the boy. There were people in each room, but the walls were lined with the most horrific torture devices of all kinds. Moreover, due to the winding path, she had no idea where they might be or where the exit was. The fairy was puzzled and did not know whether she would be able to get out if she went along this path. She knew she was running out of strength. She wanted to look at one more room and then come back. Looking into the room, she saw a man eating cookies. The young fairy was surprised to see the cookies. Looking closely at the cookies, she realized that they were chocolate. She was shocked and wanted to take it away. The fairy wanted to take it and share it with her new friend. The fairy was a little puzzled, as the cookie was too close to the man. If she collided with him, he might notice her. She knew that at such moments she could do nothing, but she still decided that she needed to use Fatares. With the help of the life force accumulated in the fate, fairies can use a unique ability that only they possess. It's called Fatares. She decided to use the Fatares transition now, magic that allows passage, even through living beings. She knew that if she touched the person, they wouldn't catch her. She really wanted to take the cookie. She knew that even a small cookie would do. The fairy desperately wanted to bring the boy all the best in this world. She desperately wanted to see him smile. The fairy still managed to steal the cookie. It was hard for her, but she continued to fly with the cookie. She was very tired, having lost so much strength during the funeral. She felt like she would collapse at any second, but she was very glad she had made it. She took the chocolate chip cookie and really hoped that she would soon be able to treat the young boy. She hoped that he would like the cookies very much. The young fairy flew, smiling and humming a song. She was very curious to see if he would show her his sweet smile again. She forgot her original goal. Smiling, she overcame the wall and joyfully shouted to the little man that she had returned. Smiling, she said she had brought something truly amazing. She smiled and said he'd definitely like it. But then she looked at him and saw him sitting on the cold floor, bursting into tears next to a flower. The young fairy was in shock. She didn't understand what had happened or why he was crying. The young boy muttered something incomprehensible. The fairy looked at him and asked if he'd been hit again. She saw he was crying, and his fingers were all cut and bloody. She couldn't understand what kind of cruel person could have done such a thing. The boy hugged the young fairy tightly and wept furiously. She realized that now he was crying because of her. She knew he probably thought she was gone. He was crying and looking for her. She looked at him and asked for forgiveness. She said she didn't know he would be so sad for her, but she still looked for him. The young fairy tenderly wiped away his tears and said she promised she would never leave him alone again. She looked at him and asked him not to cry. The fairy looked at him and said that when he cried, it hurt her a lot. A moment later, she remembered that she had brought him cookies. She looked at him and said that as an apology, she would give him a gift. She looked at him and said that he probably had never tried cookies. She realized he hadn't had a chance to eat a chocolate chip cookie in prison. The young boy stared at the cookie. The young fairy smiled and said that the cookie was definitely delicious. The fairy heard an incomprehensible crackling sound and looked at the boy in bewilderment. The little boy broke a cookie and handed it to her. The young fairy was surprised. She looked at him and asked if he was offering to eat with her. She was very pleased, smiled, looked at him and asked if he wanted to eat together. The young fairy looked at him and realized that she had already made a decision. In his absence, she wanted to continue exploring this place. The fairy frantically wanted to find out why the boy had to suffer so much. She sincerely wanted to help him. The little boy was the first person she allowed to see her, because he had a smile that made her happy. The young boy smiled and said the cookies were delicious. The fairy was surprised. She was very glad that he said the word. She looked at him and said with a smile that she was very glad he had learned another word. She also said that he was a great boy. Smiling, she said that he really was the best person. The fairies really liked the little boy. The boy and the fairy slept quietly and soundlessly in the damp dungeon. The fairy woke up and wondered how long she had slept. Stretching, she looked at the boy and asked if he had slept well. She saw that she was very dirty and was surprised. She decided to ask the little man about it anyway. The fairy understood that she would have to wash herself with her power. She decided to use a drop of water from the source given to her. She was very happy because now she became cleaner. A moment later, she saw a little boy. He woke up and she looked at him and asked with a smile if he had slept well. The boy looked at her in surprise. The young fairy smiled and asked if he was surprised. The fairy flew closer to him and said that this was an ability that only fairies possessed. She said she wanted to wash him too, but unfortunately, this ability only applies to fairies. The fairy smiled and looked at the young boy. She said she was very glad his wounds had healed quickly. She also said the swelling on his cheek had gone down, and surprisingly, the wounds on his lips had already disappeared. She looked at him and said with a smile that she thought he really was a special child. After coming here, she set several goals for herself. She looked at him and said she wasn't honey, but a fairy. The first goal was to teach the little boy to speak. She looked at him and said with a smile that he didn't need to eat her. Her second goal was to someday reach the surface with him. The boy looked at her and said with a smile, "Don't eat." The third goal is to find a name for him. She knew that such a sweet child could not help but have a name. The young fairy smiled, flying closer to him and telling him that everything was correct. If he was a little confused, he could figure it out with his own eyes. A moment later, their conversation was interrupted and they heard a noise. The boy and the fairy looked intently at the man who came to take the boy. Her final goal was to find out what the boy had been through. The man glared at the boy and told him to come out. The fairy was furious, realizing the man had come to take her friend away again. She decided she wouldn't send him away alone this time. The young fairy flew closer to the boy and quietly whispered in his ear that he should not worry, as she would follow him immediately. She asked him if he understood that this man could not see her. The man looked sideways with anger at the boy and told him not to stand still and to follow him quickly. The fairy quietly whispered in his ear that he should act as if he didn't see her. The fairy was surprised and did not understand why the boy did not respond to her words. She looked at him with embarrassment and realized that he was pretending now. She was surprised and also amazed. Looking at him, she realized that he was quite pleased and sweet. The fairy wanted to kiss him right then and there, but she knew she had to hold out until the very end. She couldn't dissuade him from his role. The young fairy sat on his shoulder and followed him. Walking with the little man through more than 100 rooms, they climbed to the next floor and finally arrived at a place with no markings on the door. But what she saw after opening the door were people unknown to her who looked suspicious. They were dressed in white robes and masks, and she also saw a creepy-looking bed. She looked around intently, not understanding what this place was. One of those present looked at the boy and told him to lie down on the bed. The young boy quietly obeyed. The man looked at his companion and told her to check the baby's condition. The woman looked at the boy and said that his condition was satisfactory and there was nothing strange. The young fairy was puzzled. She didn't understand what satisfactory meant. She knew he'd been beaten just yesterday. The fairy was shocked. She didn't know what these people were planning to do with him. The man calmly said he was going to inject reagent number 8. They took turns administering different types of medication. A man wearing glasses was writing something in a notebook. The fairy was puzzled as she looked at the notebook and did not understand what he was writing. She stared at the notebook and saw an entry from February 1971. It described corneal strengthening, limbic lobe improvement, femoral muscle enhancement, and the first psychological correction. The young fairy was frightened, as she knew no matter how she looked at it, this didn't look like recording or treatment. She didn't understand what kind of psychological correction this was. The man looked at his companions and told them to stop, saying they needed to move on to the next step. The woman came closer to the little boy. A moment later, a small ball began to glow near the boy. The young fairy was shocked as she realized that the woman was using a skill from the realm of the mind. A moment later, the fairy became even more frightened as she realized that the woman was using the mind control skill. The woman looked at the boy and said that he was just his master's tool. The boy, without opening his eyes, whispered that he was his master's tool. For several minutes, the woman brainwashed the boy, and the young boy said he obeyed his master and that he didn't think or reason. She looked at him and told him to repeat that he wasn't in control of himself. She continued to use mind control for some time. Opening his eyes, the boy said in a trembling voice that he couldn't control himself. The young fairy was shocked, seeing her friend repeating the same words over and over again. She was shocked. And she understood that it was only for the sake of his master that he couldn't stop thinking or control himself. The fairy looked intently at the boy and did not understand whose wish it was. She knew that even this little one could crave something tasty. He was capable of admiring beautiful things. She knew he had a will and resistance to mind control. The fairy stared intently at the drugs they were injecting him with. The fairy was perplexed and couldn't understand why some master would deprive a small child of his right to choose. She knew he hadn't even appeared in the labyrinth. The fairy knew that no one could be the master of the beautiful boy. She desperately desired to free him from the shackles that bound him every day. She knew that even if such a person existed, the one who could make the boy happy must be chosen by the boy himself. The young fairy looked at the boy tearfully and said she would definitely find the owner. She asked the boy not to give in to the whispers. She flew closer to him and said with a smile that they would never do something like that to him again. The young boy smiled. His smile was short-lived. The people in the room were surprised that the boy smiled. The fairy looked at him tearfully, frantically begging him not to give in to the whispers. She was very glad that he smiled at her. The man was shocked that the boy smiled. The woman looked at him, puzzled, and asked what he had said. She knew it was simply impossible, as she was certain her mind control was definitely working. The man, who was closely recording and observing the boy, said that the boy had definitely just smiled. He looked at the woman and told her to increase her consciousness control. The woman was a little puzzled and said that the boy's intensity was already high. The man glared at his companion and asked if she'd forgotten about the recent incident with the weed. He said the fewer risks, the better. He said the boy didn't need emotions. The young fairy was furious. She didn't want them to hurt him. The woman looked at her companions and said she was finished. She was surprised by how powerful the repulsion force was. The woman said the boy had incredible willpower. The man looked at her and said it was truly amazing, since this psychological correction had been in development for 10 years. They were puzzled that a weed had undermined its effectiveness. The young fairy was surprised, as she realized they were talking about her flower. The man continued frantically recording the information. He said it was the child who had caused trouble for Octarim himself, to Solar. The man said they needed to repeat it 10 more times, and the intensity should be maximum. The woman looked at him and said she understood everything. With that, they completed the correction. The boy was taken back to the dungeon. The fairy, for her part, was somewhat relieved that the boy hadn't been beaten. But even though he wasn't beaten, she was still very angry. Their correction and what they were doing was very strange. She didn't know whether it was for him or not, but she was sure of one thing. He didn't want it. The young fairy stared at the boy. She saw his empty eyes. A moment later, she looked at him with a smile and mentally asked him not to worry, as she was with him now. Approaching the dungeon, she was surprised as she realized that this was not their room. The guard angrily pushed the boy and he fell to the floor. The guard looked at the boy and asked if he liked his new room, devoid of any light. The guard said that while the boy was there, he would work hard to decorate his old room, so the boy didn't have to worry. The man said that not a single blade of grass could grow there anymore. The man looked at the boy intently and asked him with a smirk how he dared avoid his gaze. He also asked why he was trying to hide the strange weed. The man said the boy must have been looking at him with a smirk. As he left, the man told the boy to wait for him, as next time would be even more fun. After the man left, the young fairy flew up to the little man and asked if he was okay. The fairy said that the man was a very bad person. She couldn't understand how he could lock the boy in such a small room just because he wanted a plant. She couldn't understand how he could treat it like that. She was furious and said it was just an insignificant plant. A moment later, she said she took it back, as it was an unusual weed for him. She thanked him for caring so tenderly for her flower. She looked at him and said that the man had been right, and that it would be very difficult for the flower to grow in the room. She smiled and flew closer to him with a flower in her hands. She looked at him and asked if this flower would be enough for him. The little boy slowly reached out his hand to the flower. The boy looked intently at the beautiful flower. The fairy was very glad that the boy finally smiled. They spent several days there, but eventually, unable to grow a single blade of grass, they were able to return to their abandoned room. The guard looked at the boy with disdain and said the gloomy room suited him better. He said he would keep a close eye on the boy from that day on. The man grinned and said that the boy should be careful and called him number 4. The young boy stared intently after the man as he walked away. The young fairy was surprised that the man called her friend number 4. She was furious because she knew that this couldn't be her friend's name. The fairy flew closer to him and told him not to worry about it. The fairy smiled and said she'd definitely come up with a more beautiful name for him. The boy muttered something incomprehensible. She smiled and said that she was a fairy. The boy looked at her and said that she was a fairy. She flew closer to him and said that he had said everything correctly and that he had done well. She repeated once again that she was a fairy. The fairy was very worried, as she needed to formulate an escape plan and also provide him with food. She understood that this would require frequent departures. She didn't know if everything would be all right. She looked at him and thought that she should teach him now. The fairy flew closer to him and told him to look at her. She thought she needed to tell him that she would return even if he couldn't see her. She said that from now on, she would disappear frequently for short periods, but she would return immediately, so he would have to wait. She looked at him and asked if he understood. Looking at him, she realized that he didn't seem to understand a word. She realized she needed to show him directly. The essence of the Fatara's transition is the concentration of energy, given its origin within and the becoming of spirit. In other words, demoralization and becoming invisible to the human eye. Now she was invisible to the young boy. The boy looked in confusion at where the fairy had been. A moment later, he glanced around the room and muttered something. The fairy realized he was looking for her. She didn't know whether to appear now or wait a little longer. A moment later, she appeared before him in her usual form. The boy muttered something, puzzled. The fairy smiled and asked how he was. A moment later, she saw that the boy had started to cry. The fairy looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. The boy called her in a trembling voice. The fairy was shocked, because looking at the boy, she realized that she had made a very stupid mistake. She understood that what he needed now was not studying at all. She understood that he needed someone's warmth. The fairy flew closer to him, wanting to calm him down. She promised to protect him, but she made him cry again. She didn't know what to do to make him stop crying. She didn't understand what she needed to do to make him smile again. She wanted him to smile again when he looked at her. A moment later, she took on the form of a human. She looked at him with a smile and told him to come to her. The boy was surprised and slowly extended his hand to her. The young fairy hugged him tightly. She was very glad that she could share her warmth with him. For a while, the young fairy sat and hugged the boy tightly. Pulling away from him, she said she was very angry. She didn't understand why he had to be locked up in such a place. She didn't understand why he was constantly being beaten. She said he should eat proper food, not something that tasted like garbage. She looked at him and asked why he was expected to live for others and not for himself. The boy looked at her in surprise. She looked at him and asked if this was really his entire world. The boy looked at her in surprise and said nothing. The young fairy looked at him and said that she still thought he didn't understand anything. She looked at him and said that of course she was still weak, but she really wanted to save him. She said that she sincerely wanted to show him the good things in the outside world. The fairy said that therefore, if he wanted, they could run away from here together. The young boy looked at her intently. A moment later, he smiled and said that he agreed with her, calling her a fairy. She was surprised. The fairy looked at him intently and asked if he had answered her. The little boy smiled and confirmed her words. She was shocked, but also very happy. Because he was responding to her, and most importantly, he was responding of his own free will. The young fairy was very proud of him, for he was so sweet. With lightning speed, she hugged him and kissed him on the cheek. The fairy smiled and said she had decided everything and knew about him. She said she would find out why he ended up in such a place. The boy was confused by Feeney's actions. She said with a smile that she would teach him words so they could talk a lot. But most importantly, she said, they would become friends. The little boy looked at her intently. The young fairy smiled and said that they were friends now. He was her first friend, and she sincerely wanted to do something for him. The young fairy realized that she had been in this form for too long. It was very difficult for her to be in this form. A moment later, she resumed her form. The young fairy flew closer to the boy and apologized. She said she'd like to spend more time with him in human form, but now it seemed that was her limit. The young fairy smiled and said that sometimes she would turn into a human and hug him. The fairy said that now it was necessary to focus on his education. The boy agreed with her. The next day, she flew into the room and said with a smile that she was back. The boy greeted her with a smile. He was very glad that she had returned. The fairy flew closer to him and said he was a good boy for waiting for her and not even crying. The boy was surprised, as he didn't understand the meaning of the word good boy. The young fairy smiled and said that he was a great guy. The boy looked intently at the fairy. A moment later, he pointed to his cheek and repeated that she had said he was a good boy. The young fairy looked at him in surprise. She asked, puzzled, what he meant by that. A moment later, she looked at him and asked if he wanted a kiss as a reward. She realized that was why he had been humbly waiting for her. She was surprised, but also said that if he liked it, she was ready to kiss him anytime. A moment later, she flew up to him and kissed him on the cheek. She looked at him and was surprised, as if he understood what she was saying. He smiled brightly. The fairy wanted to teach the boys many things. She knew that if they joined forces, they would one day be able to escape this prison. Sometime later, the boy was taken away again. The fairy was shocked by what she saw. She realized that time had not waited for them. The mind control at stage 5 was too brutal. He returned each time in a terrible state, even despite the fairy. The boy simply fell to the floor and fell asleep like a dead man. The young fairy, unable to contain her emotions, wept tearfully. She frantically begged him for forgiveness. The fairy felt helpless, unable to protect him, and she cried endlessly in pain. The woman looked intently at the boy and told him to lie down on the bed. The fairy looked at the boy. She couldn't do anything about it. She didn't understand why they kept doing this. Her heart broke at the torment he had to endure. She screamed furiously and asked them what they would gain from bullying the child. She looked at the boy in surprise and asked him if he was angry at all. She was sobbing and asking him to say something. She said she was very sad and very angry. He told her to wait. The young fairy was surprised. The boy looked into the distance and told the fairy that he would return and she should wait. Having said this, the boy pushed her out the door into the laboratory. She was shocked and looked at the door in surprise. The fairy understood that the boy wanted to go through this alone, but she didn't understand why he said that. Sitting on the floor in the dungeon, she couldn't understand why he had sent her away. She wanted to give him strength by being near him. She remembered their last conversation and realized something. The fairy realized that the boy was very worried about her, and that's why he pushed her away. She felt very sad about this. She realized he didn't want to show her how he was suffering, because it would be hard for her to watch. That's why he told her to wait. Sitting on the floor, she scolded herself and told herself to pull herself together and not give in. She knew there was no time for tears now, as she had to think about how she and the little man could escape from here. She looked at the door and apologized to him, as he had said to wait for him. She knew she simply couldn't leave him alone in such a place. She couldn't let him go through such pain alone. She knew that in order to leave here with him, she would become stronger. The fairy knew that she would do anything for him. A moment later, the fairy flew through the door. She overheard people talking. A man was asking about the results of their dynamic visual acuity tests. The woman replied that the results had improved. The man looked at the notebook with a grin and wrote something down. He said with a grin that it was very good. The girl looked at him and said everything was going smoother than before. The man said it was all thanks to the weed incident. The man looked at his companion and said that after being deprived of something precious to him, the point of his final resistance had disappeared. The man said the boy had completely succumbed to them. The young fairy was shocked by what she heard. She hadn't expected such a thing. She was in shock and didn't understand what they were even talking about. The woman looked at the boy and said that this incident even gave rise to the name Viz. She said it suited him very well, as Viz literally meant weed. The man looked at the boy and said he completely agreed with her, as the name was very fitting for an insignificant boy. He looked at the boy with a smirk and congratulated him on his name. The young fairy was shocked by everything. The fairy was shocked by what she heard. She did not understand what name they gave him. She didn't understand how they managed to completely suppress his inner selves. She looked at him, wondering if there was any point in resisting. She flew closer to him, wanting to know if this was true. The fairy stared at her friend, who lay quietly on the terrible bed. She heard the man say that they needed to continue further. The fairy was shocked and wanted to know if it was true that he had lost his desire to leave the dungeon with her. The fairy flew closer to him and called him. The boy caught her. She looked at him intently and timidly asked if he was okay. The boy hugged the fairy tightly. The young fairy looked intently at the boy. She was surprised by his action. She looked at him and asked in surprise if he was missing. The boy only smiled in response. The young fairy was a little puzzled, as she thought something was wrong. She said that if his self had truly disappeared, he wouldn't be able to look at her with such a smile. The young fairy decided to try to do what the woman had done. The fairy looked at him and asked who his master was. The young boy looked at her intently, surprised by her questions. She looked at him and told him to answer, and asked him again who his master was. She realized that he couldn't answer her question. The young fairy realized that he had not been hit by the spiritual skill. She realized he was only pretending to be brainwashed. She was very glad he had managed to deceive them. The young fairy looked at him with tears in her eyes. The fairy flew closer to him and said that she thought she had lost him forever. She looked at him and said that he was a great guy and she was very happy. The young boy was very happy. The fairy looked at him and said that those people called him a weed and worthless. A waitha because of their wish. She looked at him and said that he definitely needed a better name. The fairy said that she needed to go outside. The fairy looked at him and said that she would go and find out something about him, and then she would find out his real name. She looked at him and said that she wanted to give him a name that would bring love, not the number 4 or Viz. She flew closer to him and said that she would definitely bring him something tasty, so he should wait quietly for her. The boy looked at her and agreed. The fairy was very glad that he understood her. The fairy flew through the door with the speed of lightning and shouted to him that she would be back soon. Using the Fatare's passage, she passed through the ceiling. Then she reached the spire. She flew further and further, unsure if she would reach the peak before the energy ran out. But she knew she could overcome it and escape with the boy. Once outside, she saw the top of the tower. The young fairy looked at the dungeon in surprise and intently. Besides this, she saw a beautiful view. The young fairy saw a beautiful city that was near the dungeon. The fairy was very surprised. She could not take her eyes off such beauty. The young fairy was very happy and smiled at such beauty. She was very glad that she was able to get out, as the gust of wind was very refreshing for her. She felt the same feeling that she experienced when she was born into this world. The young fairy was overjoyed and decided to tell the boy everything she had seen later. She knew they were together and were following how vast and wide this world was. She wanted to know how beautiful the things were and what delicious things it contained. The mere thought of this made her feel wonderful. The young fairy decided to set off for the village immediately. The man shouted for people to buy various weapons. He also said they were selling hemostatic, healing, and refined tablets. The woman looked at him and said the scabies crystals were grade 4. She looked at him and asked if he thought the price was reasonable. The fairy looked down from a bird's eye view at all the people walking the streets. The young fairy flew closer and heard the man asking the woman if she had made a contract with the fairy of protection. The young fairy also heard many interesting things. She was interested in everything. She looked at everyone with a surprised smile. She knew that because the village was a domain of doom, many items useful in battle were sold there. They asked the man where the fairy didn't drop from. The man looked at the interlocutor and said it was too expensive to buy through a middleman. The other man, in turn, said that if he saw a fairy, he would catch her in an instant. The young fairy realized that she had to be careful not to be noticed or caught. The young lady heard someone say, "Fairy." She was surprised. The young fairy looked intently at the older fairy. The fairy looked at her new friend and asked her whether she was a fairy or not. As the fairy began, she realized that she was facing a real fairy. The fairy looked at her new friend and asked when she was born. The flower fairy modestly replied that she was born in the area from a fairy drop. The fairy looked at the flower fairy and was amazed. She said that she was a newborn Aeson and was born on Uranus. She was amazed. From the conversation, the flower fairy realized that fairies rarely appeared in such a place. She didn't know the number of fairies in each region, but she could only understand the Aeson. Aeson is a word used to denote a fairy's level. Fae are classified by level based on the number of attributes they possess. The first attribute is Isten, the second attribute is Fariel, the third is Bi-Akalaz, the fourth attribute is Kranfa, the fifth attribute is Yola. The last level is the fairy ruler. Most remain with the rank of Bakalas and 3 attributes. Only a small number reach the rank of Kranfa. The fairy smiled and said that she was a Kranfa fairy. She also said that she was very pleased to meet the young fairy. The young fairy was surprised that her first meeting was with a fairy of great rank. The young fairy noticed that her new acquaintance had been looking at her with great friendliness just a minute ago. The fairy looked at the flower fairy and asked her name. The young fairy smiled and said she didn't have one yet. The fairy looked at her and said it looked like she was born not long ago. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked if this was her first time at the market. The young fairy smiled and said yes, and she was just looking around. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked if she should give her a tour. The precise fairy smiled and thanked her new acquaintance. She said she had expended all her energy and would have to return soon. The fairy added that it seemed her fate was empty. The fairy looked at the young fairy and told her to extend her hand. A moment later, the fairy was illuminated by a bright light. The young fairy was surprised as she realized that the energy of Pei Vita was flowing into her. The young fairy looked at her companion and said that she was already full. The fairy smiled and apologized. She said that Aizen's fate was very limited. The fairy looked at her new companion and said that since she had so much energy, they could do something interesting. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked her what she wanted to do. The young fairy, puzzled, said that she'd primarily like to find a watch and bread. The fairy looked at her companion in surprise and asked why bread, since there was something more delicious. The flower fairy looked at her companion and asked if the bread tasted better than the cookies. The fairy smiled and said, "Yes, but there is some," and asked if the flower fairy would like to try it. The fairy looked at her companion and asked what she preferred. A moment later, she pulled something interesting out of the portal. The fairy smiled and handed it to the young. The fairy got some cotton candy. She smiled and told her to try it. The young fairy was surprised and asked her companion if this Fatares was the door that opened the fairy star. The fairy looked at her companion and smiled, saying that it was true and that it was a convenient Fatares, like a pocket. The young fairy decided to try the taste of cotton candy. After taking a bite, she was amazed. It was very tasty. The fairy looked at her companion and asked if she liked it. The young fairy, smiling, said it was delicious. She then asked if she could take it with her. The fairy smiled and said she could do whatever she wanted. The young fairy smiled and said she wanted to share something with the human child who lived with her. She said that unfortunately, he had never tasted anything like it. The fairy was surprised and asked what kind of child he was who had never eaten anything like it. The young fairy looked at her companion and said there was a reason for this. The fairy cast a nasty glance at the young fairy and asked if she had really become a contractor. The fairy was puzzled, as she knew the young woman was not yet capable of doing so. The young fairy smiled and said that this was her precious first friend. Therefore, if there was anything good, she wanted to share it with him. The fairy looked at her young companion with bewilderment and told her to separate from him. The young fairy looked at her companion, puzzled, and said she couldn't do that because she liked him so much. The fairy looked away, puzzled, and said she'd expected that answer. The fairy looked at the young lady and told her not to worry too much. She said that people are very capricious and they live in a different time. The flower fairy was puzzled as she knew her friend wasn't capricious, as he always looked at her with a smile. And when she transformed, they were the same age. She knew he didn't live in a time that was perfect for her either. She knew the boy was no different from her. The fairy sighed heavily and said that it was okay if she didn't understand her words right now. The fairy stroked the young fairy on the head and said that she was still very little. The fairy looked at the young woman and said with a smile that she was giving her this cotton candy and asked her to place it in her star. The young fairy smiled and said that she would certainly do so. A moment later, the fairy transformed. She looked at the young woman and said that they could go find bread and a watch. The young fairy smiled, and they walked slowly. The fairy looked at the young woman and said she had chosen a watch and given the money. She also said that when buying things, one must pay money. The young woman was a little puzzled and asked what to do if she had no money. The young fairy asked if she could simply take the goods. She said it was better not to do that, as even that could worsen the relationship between humans and fairies. Therefore, to prevent this from happening, the fairies established rules. She said that stealing and harming humans were prohibited. The fairy said that if you break the rules, a dutiful fairy will come and destroy the core. She said that if you follow the rules, you can enjoy good things. The fairy said she would introduce the young fairy to one of them. They walked slowly into the bakery. The fairy smiled and opened the door. The fairy said it was a bakery, looking at the pink-haired fairy. The fairy saw many delicious things that were on the counter. She was very surprised, as she had never seen anything like this before. The fairy looked at the young fairy and said with a smile that this was a bakery run by her friend, and that the bread there was very tasty. A moment later, the baker approached them and greeted them with a smile. The baker's name was Mamingo, and he worked at the Berry Bakery. The fairy greeted Mamingo and asked him for 2 pieces of cake. The young man said he would do everything right away and asked them to sit down at the table. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked who the young man was. The fairy smiled and said he was a worker her friend had hired. The fairy looked at her companion in surprise and asked if he was making bread and cakes here. The fairy smiled and said yes. The fairy smiled at her friend and said that the young man was a good man, so she could show herself to him. She also said that she would introduce them later. The young man brought them cakes, Mamingo. He looked at the fairy and asked why she had decided to try 2 pieces of cake. The fairy smiled and said that she was not alone and that she would eat with her friend. The fairy looked at the young fairy and asked us if she would show herself to the young man. A moment later, the young man saw the young fairy. He looked closely at the fairy and said that it was the first time he had seen such a cute fairy. The young fairy was surprised, not understanding why she was cute. She looked at her friends and asked if she was cute. Her new friends confirmed that she was cute, smiling. The young man looked at the cute fairy and asked what her name was. The older fairy said that she did not know, since the young fairy had not yet decided. The fairy said it was too early to ask her about the attribute, as the attribute was usually introduced along with the name. The young fairy stared intently, eagerly anticipating the moment when she would try it. The fairy saw that the young lady was very hungry. She smiled and wished her bon appetit. The young fairy also wished her companion a bon appetit and flew up to the cake with lightning speed. After the young fairy tried a piece of the cake, she said with a smile that it was very tasty. The fairy laughed and asked if it was so delicious that she was crying. The young fairy was shocked, as she had never tasted anything so delicious. She knew that cotton candy and chocolate chip cookies were nothing compared to the cake. She knew she couldn't be the only one to try such a delicious treat. The young man looked at the young fairy and said she'd left too much. He looked at her and asked if she didn't like the cake. The young man was a little surprised, as he knew she had really enjoyed it. But for some reason, she didn't eat any more. The fairy looked at the young man and said that the young fairy just wanted to take the cake to her friend. The young man looked at the young fairy and said that in that case, he would give her some bread, and she could eat with her friend. The fairy was surprised, looked at him, and asked if she was sure she could take it. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that, of course, he could. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that he really was a very good man. The fairy said that she would certainly repay him for his kindness. Mamingo looked at the young fairy and said that she could go with him and choose what she wanted. The fairy flew leisurely after the young man. She saw flowers. The young fairy looked at the young man and asked if he liked flowers. The young man said he liked them very much, but he couldn't buy them often because they were expensive. The young fairy was surprised. The young man said they were expensive because it wasn't easy to grow plants in their region. The young man looked closely at the fairy and said that because they were located near the domain of doom, flowers were difficult to grow. Even if they were grown, they would quickly wither and die. Such is life near death. It's like living in the grayness. He said that perhaps that's why most people like flowers. Just looking at them makes everyday life come alive. For this reason, flowers reduce people's fatigue. The young fairy stared at the flower. She didn't know if the boy would like it, but she really wanted to repay him. He looked at her and said with a smile that she could choose. She realized that since he said he liked flowers, he would certainly like her flower. He looked at her and asked if she had chosen what she wanted. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that she had chosen, and she would like strawberry tart. Misha smiled and told her to wait a little while he prepared everything. The young man looked at the young fairy and said that along with the strawberry cake, he had given her a baguette and the remaining cakes. The fairy looked at her young companion and told her to place them in her star before they cooled. A moment later, the fairy handed the watch to the young lady. The young fairy looked intently at her watch. The young fairy looked at the young people and said that they both looked like real angels. The fairy looked at the young man and said that she would try to help the young fairy until she got used to the human world. She asked the young man if he would help the young fairy. The young man smiled and said that, of course, he would help, as he too wanted to look good in the eyes of the little fairy. He was very happy, as it had been a long time since he had met a fairy he liked so much. The young man looked at the young fairy and said he was very glad they had met today. He also said that if she needed help, she could call him anytime. The young fairy was very happy and grateful to them for their support. The fairy looked at the young lady and said that she would like to give her some advice before they parted. The fairy said you shouldn't trust the people here. She said they were unusual because they lived so close to the realm of doom. She said it was full of people who wouldn't hesitate to do anything unpleasant. Silver also told the young fairy to never go outside at night, as the influence of doom becomes stronger at night. The young fairy smiled and thanked her friend for her concern. Silver looked at her young companion and told her to be sure to tell her name the next time they met. The young fairy smiled and said she would certainly do so. The young fairy said goodbye to her friend. Silver stood for a moment and watched intently as the young fairy flew away. The young fairy slowly walked back to her friend, feeling a pleasant breeze. She thought it felt that way because she had experienced so many wonderful things today. A moment later, she realized something was wrong. She felt a sensation she hadn't experienced during the day. She realized it was doom. The young fairy was surprised and wondered if it was because she had been in the darkness for so long. But a moment later, she realized she felt a surge of energy. When she was born, she liked the darkness. But after meeting a little man, that changed. With the help of the flower that overcame the darkness, she knew the joy of that boy's smile. The young fairy looked into the distance and told Death that she felt its call and heard its lure. The young fairy, smiling, said that she would not fall for it. She did not want to be caught in the net of destruction as it was at her birth. The young fairy said she would grow by feeding on darkness and illuminate any darkness in this world. She heard the sound of petals scattered in the wind, driving away death. A moment later, the young fairy looked into the distance and said that she had decided on her name. The young fairy smiled and said that from now on she would be called Shirensha. Shirensha rushed into the dungeon through the door with lightning speed. She looked at the boy with a smile and said that she had returned to him. Shirensha looked at the boy and asked if he was bored alone. She said she had brought him a mountain of amazing things. The young boy looked at her with a smile. The fairy smiled and told him to wait a little, and she would now give him everything. The fairy, smiling, brought him a strawberry tart, a baguette, and half a piece of cake. The young man looked at everything with bewilderment. The fairy laughed a little and said that she had made the same face when she first saw so many tasty treats. The young fairy and the boy quietly enjoyed their meal. The young boy looked at the fairy and said it was very tasty. She looked at him and, smiling, told him to eat it slowly. The young fairy looked at the boy and said with a smile that she had seen something else at the market. She said with a smile that she had seen a cat. She knew that even though it was a Fatara's disguise, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. The young man looked at the fairy with puzzlement and surprise. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that if he touched it, the disguise would disappear, as it was an illusion imposed from above. The young fairy looked at him and said with a smile that she had the most important news for him. She said with a smile that she had come up with a name for herself. The young fairy said with a smile that her name was now Shirensha. The boy looked at her in surprise. She looked at him and said with a smile that from this day on, her name is Shirensha. Shirensha looked intently at the boy and asked him to repeat her name. The young boy tried to repeat her name. For several minutes, the boy tried to pronounce her name. He couldn't. But the young fairy didn't give up. She pointed out his mistakes several times. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that it must be difficult for him to pronounce such a name. She looked at him and said that she thought he was doing a good job of saying Ren. The fairy looked at her friend and said that he could call her Ren. The young man looked at her and called her by name with a smile. The young fairy smiled and said he was a good boy. She learned that it would be very nice if he had his own name. She looked at him intently and wondered, confused, if she would ever be able to find his name. She knew that even if she could find a name for him, she didn't know if it would make sense in such a place. The young fairy looked at the boy and asked if she could give him a name. The young man looked at her in surprise. But a moment later, he said she could give him a name. The fairy smiled and said the name was very important. She was surprised he could give her an answer so easily. The young fairy looked at her friend and said they could come up with a name together. She really wanted to come up with a name that would suit him. The fairy said she wanted to give him a name that conveyed the idea of hope for divine blessing. She said the name should consist of 3 syllables. Spring. For a moment, she wondered if she should come up with a name similar to her. After a few minutes of thought, she said with a smile that she would call him Rieren from now on. The young fairy looked at him and, smiling, told him to repeat it. The young man looked at her in surprise and repeated his new name. The young fairy smiled and said that he was her source, so she wanted her name to have 1 syllable from his name. The young fairy smiled and said that he was her Rio and she was his Ren. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he said with a cheese smile that she was his Ren. The young fairy was surprised. Her heart began to pound violently, as if her core had broken. She didn't know if there was anything so beautiful in this world. She thought she could never let him go. After the young fairy gave the boy a name, she explored the prison with even greater enthusiasm. The recordings she'd seen in the lab were the only clue. But unfortunately, there was nothing else useful. She discovered that Rio was locked up on the 17th floor. But there were also other prisoners receiving enhancements. Ren wanted to make a map and escape prison, but the moment she took paper and pencil with her, she would be caught. She knew she had no choice but to memorize everything. Ren decided to go to the control room. The young fairy saw something interesting. She saw a map of the 8th zone. The young fairy realized the dungeon was a labyrinth, and she wasn't even surprised, as she knew she couldn't find her way because of it. Looking closely at the map, she realized it was sorted not by floors, but by zones. She stared at the map for a while, taking in every detail. She realized her friend was trapped in Zone 10. Looking at the map, she noticed an incomprehensible black circle. She was surprised, as no explanation was left. Ren still decided that there was nothing to worry about, and thought about going to where the black circle was to find out everything herself. As she headed to her destination, she noticed young people standing near an iron door. Ren was surprised and didn't understand what the 2 men were guarding. But she still thought there was something very important behind the door. Ren knew she had to get in there and see what was behind the door. A moment later, she flew through the door with lightning speed. Ren was a little surprised, realizing it wasn't even an obstacle. She was determined to see what was in such a place. A moment later, the young fairy saw a gate in front of her. The young fairy stared at the gate. She didn't know if it was connected to the labyrinth of doom, but a moment later, she realized the sensation was different. The young fairy was surprised and realized this was most likely the exit. In other words, this place is already a space of destruction. The young fairy noticed an excessively winding path, and the energy of destruction spreading everywhere proved it. This place is a labyrinth of destruction. The young fairy wondered what the intentions of the owner of this prison were. Ren knew it was dangerous for a fairy like her to be in such a place, but she also knew that someday she would get her chance. The young fairy decided at first to use only the stairs to escape. While exploring the labyrinth, she saw the 7th zone. The 7th zone was full of people training. There were also people who were practicing pistol shooting. Looking at the map of the control room, she found out that there were 3 black gates here. The 5th zone was full of researchers and research materials. The young fairy looked at everything, wondering if there was anything there about her friend. She knew that if she found something, she could come here often, but still she knew that she had no time to rest, as she had to go to the next floor. The 4th zone contained food storage and a kitchen. The 3rd zone consisted of ordinary cells and control rooms. The lower she descended, the more restrictions and powerful prisoners there were. She had no idea what terrible crime her friend, who was locked up in the 10th zone, had committed, but she still knew that they would be able to use the stairs to escape outside. After a while, she emerged. The young fairy wanted to go to the pastry shop. She wanted to pay the pastry chef for his kindness and learn how to make money. The young fairy flew into the pastry shop with the speed of lightning. A moment later, she stopped and thought, as she couldn't remember which way the pastry shop was. Flying through the city, the young fairy saw people sitting at a table and talking. She also saw cute children who were playing happily. She was very happy because she saw that everyone was having fun. She knew that despite their proximity to the realms of destruction, people lived happy lives. The young fairy desperately wanted Rio to be happy, just like the children. Flying through the middle of the crowd, she saw a musician. A handsome man sat with his eyes closed and played an instrument. The young fairy looked at him as he sang a beautiful song. She was surprised because she heard a beautiful voice. Just listening to it made her feel bolder. Everyone present was delighted with the young man's singing. The young fairy noticed that the man was using a spiritual skill. She was very curious about his eyes, as they were hidden behind a bandage. The young fairy thought that his eyes were definitely as bright as his voice. Ren saw people throwing coins to him. The young fairy was surprised because she realized she had to pay too. She was very puzzled and did not know what to do as she had no money at all. The fairy liked the song so much that she decided to give him double the money the next time they met. Ren decided to find out a way to make money. The young fairy stared at the young man. She felt as if their eyes had met. She was puzzled by this because she knew that if she did not give his permission, he would not be able to see her. She thought that she had imagined it after all and decided to immediately look around and find a bakery. The young man was very happy to meet the fairy and greeted her. He said with a smile that he had been looking forward to seeing her. The young fairy was surprised, not expecting to be expected. She looked at the young man and asked in surprise why he was waiting for her. He said that such a young fairy could easily be slain, and he was worried that something might happen to her. Ren smiled and told him not to worry, as she was strong and wouldn't give in to death. She looked at him with a smile and said she had come up with a name for herself. The young man was surprised and said they could now introduce themselves. He smiled and said his name was Mamingo Berry. He was a pastry chef at the Berry Berry Bakery. The young fairy smiled and said she was a flower fairy and her name was Sharensha. The young man was surprised as he hadn't expected her to be a flower fairy. The young man said that the mere birth of a fairy was rare in their lands, and so he was greatly surprised that she was a flower fairy. The young fairy only smiled and said nothing. A moment later, she looked at him and said she wanted to give him her flower. Mamingo was surprised. He looked at her with a smile and said it was a great honor for him. The young fairy looked at him and asked if he could extend his hands to her. A moment later, a flower grew in his palms. Mamingo was very surprised because he didn't even believe that the flower would be so beautiful. The young fairy was very glad that he liked her flower. The young man smiled at her and said he would go and put it in a vase. He also asked her if she would like something tasty as a gift in return. The young fairy was very pleased with this offer. Mamingo brought her a piece of cake and wished her bon appétit. The young fairy pounced on the cake with lightning speed. She was very happy because she felt the delicious taste of the cake. The young man looked at her and asked if she liked the food. He also said he'd prepared a portion for her friend so she could eat more. The young fairy thanked him with a smile. Mamingo looked at her and said he really wanted to repay her for the beautiful flower. He also asked if she needed anything else. Ren looked at him and asked if he could tell her more about this place. She knew that to help Rio escape, she needed to know everything about this world. The young man smiled and said it wouldn't be difficult for him to do. He also said he'd need some supplies first. He showed her the sphere and said it was their planet. And the square picture depicted oceans and continents. There are planets in space. They are divided into initial and complete. He said they are divided by the presence or absence of a fairy. He showed her a planet where there is no fairy ruler, which is why the planet bears this name. He also said that the old central continent represents the origin zone, suitable for human habitation. The dark part outside is called the domain of destruction. The young man looked at the fairy and asked if she wanted to look further at the map. He said that at the northernmost point of this continent lies the Kavid Empire. Ulan touches the darkness outside. The young man looked at the young fairy and pointed to the map where the Lancer was. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked what castle was depicted on the map. Mamingo replied that it was the castle of the Lancer ruler. Mamingo said the castle was known as the worst underground prison in the Iphos Empire. He said a labyrinth of death was built using it. The worst criminals enter there and can never leave. Ren said the labyrinth's destructive nature resembled a cancer spreading across the entire area of its origin. She looked at it and asked if humans could use it. He smiled and confirmed her suspicions, saying that for now its properties were fine. She looked at him and asked if he knew of the existence of the ultimate doom, the one who became the core of the labyrinth of doom. The young man explained that the ultimate doom was originally a fairy of the Yola rank, a fairy who had transformed into an evil spirit. She was sealed and left in the labyrinth. Ren looked at the map and asked if it meant Ifos was currently under the control of a ruler. Mamingo confirmed her words and said that the current owner of the castle was Duke Devilic. Musil. Ren knew there was a high probability that Rio's master was the Duke. She was very angry. As she realized that he was now her enemy, she looked at Mamingo and asked what kind of man the castle's owner was. The young man looked at his companion with bewilderment and said that, according to rumors, he was incredibly heartless and cruel. Mamingo said he was a solar of the Enarim rank. The young lady was shocked by what she heard. She realized the Duke was extremely powerful, as his rank was extremely rare. He was on par with Fairy Yule in strength. The young fairy looked at the floor, puzzled, and said that the Duke was definitely very much so. The young man looked at her, puzzled. Mamingo looked at her and asked if she planned to commit a crime. The young fairy was shocked. She hadn't expected such a question. A moment later, she looked puzzled and said that she simply wanted to experience the human world. Mamingo smiled and said that if she wanted to become a little criminal, she should build up her strength and earn a lot of money. The young fairy looked at him in surprise. The young man smiled and said that if she had at least one of those things, she would have a chance of being acquitted. Ren smiled and said she understood. Ren realized that with the money she could free Rio from prison. The young fairy looked at her companion and said that she had decided to make a lot of money. The young man laughed. He looked at her with a smile and asked how she would do it. Ren said that she wanted to sell flowers and also asked what he thought about it. The young man smiled and said that was very good, as he was sure everyone would like the flowers. The young fairy smiled and asked what price she should set for them in that case. She asked him if she could buy a cheesecake by selling 4 flowers. The young man looked at her, puzzled. Ren watched his reaction and asked if it was too expensive. She looked at him and said she could sell 6 coils. The young man looked at her and asked if he hadn't said that the plants in their area were very rare. She smiled and said that he had said that, but the cakes still cost more. Their conversation was interrupted by a customer. She entered the bakery and greeted Mamingo with a smile. She said she would like to buy a bag of peanut butter cookies and a slice of a special cake. Upon entering the bakery, she immediately noticed a beautiful flower. The young customer was shocked. She stared at the flower. Later, she asked Mamingo where he got such a beautiful flower. For several minutes, she questioned the young man about where he got such a beautiful flower. The young man, in turn, only smiled. The young man looked at the fairy and said that this lady was his good friend. He looked at the fairy and asked if she could show herself to him. She looked at the young man and asked if he would finally tell her where he bought such a flower. A moment later, Ren revealed her true form. The young lady was shocked, not expecting to see a fairy. The young lady looked at the fairy and asked her name. She also introduced herself, saying her name was Remy Ingle. Ren looked at the girl and said she was the flower fairy Shirensha, who was born in Ulan. Remy was shocked, as she hadn't expected a flower fairy to be born in Ulan. Remy looked at Ren and asked if she had understood correctly that the flower's owner was Ren. The young fairy smiled and said yes, and that it was her gift. The young man smiled and told his friend that the fairy didn't yet know what was happening in the world. He smiled and said that the fairy was worried that no matter how many flowers she sold, she still wouldn't have enough money for one cheesecake. Remy looked at the fairy and told her to listen carefully, as plants in their region were incredibly expensive. She said that flowers, especially endemic species, would sell like hotcakes. Ren was surprised. Ren looked at her new friends and said that to buy a Mamingo cake, there must be a lot of money. Remy looked at the fairy and asked how she planned to spend her earnings. Ren, puzzled, replied that her first friend had a hard time getting out of the Lancer's ranks. So she wanted to buy nice things and share them with him. Remy was surprised, as she knew newborn fairies usually embark on grand journeys. She stared at the fairy, wondering just how close she truly was to this friend. Mamingo looked at Ren and said he'd spoken to the fairy she'd met a couple of days ago, and she'd said she'd be visiting soon. Ren was both surprised and delighted by the news. Remy looked at Ren and said she was thinking about something. Ren looked at her, puzzled. Remy said that the fairy had better not tell anyone that she was born in Ulan. She said that not only were there dangerous people of all kinds here, but the castle's owner herself might come for her. Ren was a little puzzled, as she knew the castle's owner was the Duke. She looked at her acquaintance and asked why this famous and feared man would come for her. She said the castle's owner periodically receives lists of the fairies living in the Lancer. He hosts grand receptions to which he invites powerful and special fairies. Remy said that since Ren was a flower fairy born in Ulan, she would definitely receive an invitation from the tower's owner. Ren was shocked, as she realized it was the man who had imprisoned her friend. The young fairy was puzzled, knowing he hadn't figured it out yet. But a moment later, she realized someone might have seen the flower that had grown in the prison. She knew she'd have to be more careful after that. Remy looked at her and said with a smile that before her face darkened even more, she suggested that she come up with some specific characteristics that people could use. The young fairy looked at her acquaintance in surprise. She didn't understand what characteristics were being discussed. Remy looked at the fairy and said she was a little fairy who came from the south. Known as a fairy who sought wealth, she came to the Ulan to sell her flowers at high prices. Mamingo looked at them and said that it sounded pretty good. He said that, in fact, there are many such examples. Ren looked at her friend and said she really liked the legend. She also said with a smile that Remy was a genius. Remy smiled and said it was a piece of cake. Ren smiled, looking at Remy, and said that if it weren't for her, Ren would have continued to worry alone. Remy held Ren in her arms and asked her how she could be so sweet. The young fairy was shocked. Remy said she wanted to secretly put it in her pocket and take it with her. A fairy came into their bakery and asked who dared to torment her sweet little fairy. Daya looked at those present with bewilderment and anger. Daya looked at Remy and told her not to tease little Ison like that. Remy, puzzled, said she wasn't teasing. She was just being cute. Ren looked at Daya and said that she had finally come up with a name for herself. The fairy smiled and said that in that case they could introduce themselves to each other. She looked at Ren and said she was Kranfa, the mineral fairy, and her name was Klondaya. But everyone called her Daya. Ren smiled and said it was nice to meet you. She said with a smile that she was Yisen, the flower fairy. Her name was Shurinsha. Daya looked at Ren in surprise. Daya said that the birth of a flower fairy was very rare in their region. She couldn't understand how a flower fairy could be born in a lancer. Ren looked at everyone with a puzzled expression and said that she was just as shocked as everyone else. The young man looked at the fairies with a smile and said that since they had already finished their performance, they could sit down and eat something. Daya looked at Ren and asked if she would like to transform into a human. Daya said that if she lacked energy, she would be happy to share hers. Ren looked at the fairy in surprise and thanked her. Daya said that in that case, she would transform first. The young fairy looked at her friend in surprise and said that she would also transform. Daya looked at Ren in surprise. She said that at least she didn't expect this. Mamingo and Remy looked at Ren in surprise. They were shocked because the young fairy in human form was very cute and beautiful. Mamingo looked at his companions and told them to sit down, and he, in turn, would bring them tea and snacks. Daya looked at Ren and asked if she understood correctly that the young fairy wanted to make money by selling her flowers. Daya asked how many flowers Ren could grow in a day. Ren said she could grow about 15 flowers in a day. Daya asked Ren how she planned to sell them. Ren said she'd offer one flower at a time to people at the market. Daya looked at the young fairy with confusion and said that wouldn't work. Daya told Ren that she didn't realize the value of her flowers. She said that a fairy should strive to use her flowers to their full potential. Daya suggested selling them in the shop. Mamingo said the flowers could be sold by the ribbon. Daya looked at the young fairy and apologized. She said that Ren probably didn't know who Flora was. Flora is the best florist in Ulan. Her skill in harmoniously weaving flowers is beyond praise. She ties ribbons with a soulful touch, and the long-lasting freshness of her flowers is a distinct advantage. The young fairy was shocked. She said that it seemed like just those words conveyed what an incredible person she was. Ren thought she'd probably be able to trust someone like that with her flowers. The fairy confirmed Ren's words and said Flora would be able to appreciate her flowers better. She said that giving her the order before the sale would save Ren time and be more convenient for her. The fairy smiled and said it was already late today, so it would be better to come see her tomorrow morning. Remy smiled and said that she could come with them too. Remy said that she could help them and show them the way. Daya looked at the young woman with confusion and asked if she wasn't busy with her job as a broker. Remy smiled and said she was currently studying with her mother, so she'd have time. Remy looked at Ren and asked what she thought about 8 o'clock in the morning. The young fairy was concerned about the task, but she looked at her friend, unsure if she would be able to wake up on time. Remy suggested they simply set an alarm. The young fairy, puzzled, replied that her friend had certain circumstances, such as being locked in a dark room with no sunlight. Personal belongings are also off-limits there. Those things, like an alarm clock, would make noise. Ren said she was sharing this information with the 3 of them because she believed she could trust each of them. The young men stared at her, surprised. But they were also pleased that she trusted them. Remy said she hadn't known that. She looked at the fairy with puzzlement and said she could come as soon as she woke up. Remy looked at the fairy and asked if she needed anything else. She said that if Ren needed any information, she was free to contact her at any time. Ren looked at everyone present and asked if they had a book called How to Learn to Write and Read. Remy said she could borrow it from the library, but that was a problem right now, since a library registration card and membership card were required. Daya looked at Ren and asked if she understood correctly that Ren didn't want to be noticed by the castle's owner. She suggested they add some characterization to her setting. The young fairy looked at Daya in surprise. Daya said Ren came to earn money and met with her. Daya is a fairy who guards the guild of artisans who earn the most money in this empire. Daya said that after listening to Ren, she brought her to Ulan to sell flowers. Daya said that with a story like that, even the castle lord wouldn't be interested. She said the castle lord only interacts with battle fairies of Bakala's rank and above. The young fairy thanked her new friend. Mamingo looked at Ren and asked how he should care for her flower, as he wanted to admire it for a long time. Ren looked at the young man and told him to simply take care of the flower like he did with other plants. Although her flowers possessed a death, defying quality in their sleep, she knew she'd have to wait a bit to see how it worked. He looked at Ren and said she was a little fairy and didn't know much about her flowers. He really wanted to know how to care for them so they would last a little longer. The young fairy looked at the young man and asked him if she would grow a flower for him every time she came. The young man was surprised. The young fairy smiled and said that he had been kind to her from their very first meeting. She knew that if she befriended the young man, she could ask for cake again. She really hoped that the young man would one day teach her how to bake so that she could delight her friend in the future. The young fairy is very helpful to her new friends. Mamingo smiled and thanked her. He said with a smile that he would be very grateful and appreciative. They sat in silence for a while and drank tea. Remy burst into the bakery and said with a smile that she was back. Daya looked at Remy and said that she came back quickly and also asked what she brought. Remy smiled and said she'd brought a language workbook she'd used as a child. Remy explained that the library loan was time-limited, but since it was hers, Ren could study without worrying about time. The young fairy looked at her friends and thanked them for all the kindness they had shown her. Remy smiled and said that she felt very awkward when Ren spoke with tears in his eyes. Daya looked at Remy and Shirinsha and said with a smile that they looked very similar to each other. Daya looked at the young beauties and asked how they could connect with each other through an agency agreement. The fairy said she was talking about an agent, and specifically, she meant an exclusive broker. They act as an intermediary, facilitating meetings with whomever the client desires and assisting with any matters. The fairy looked at the young woman and said that although Remy looked like a fool, she was very capable. She said that Remy was the daughter of Soap, the best broker in the empire. And through Remy, the young fairy could achieve anything. The young fairy was delighted with this news. She really liked the proposal. A moment later, the young fairy said that she liked the offer very much, but she had nothing to offer Remy to secure the contract. Remy looked at the young fairy and said that she would make a contract with her if she gave her one flower each time. Ren was surprised by the price. Remy looked at her and said her flowers were worth it. She knew that for sure, even though she was a complete newbie in the brokerage business. Remy smiled and said she was still learning from her mother, so she asked the young fairy to be understanding if she was a little clumsy. She smiled and added that this would be her first agency contract too. Remy looked at the young fairy and said she would work hard. The young fairy stared intently at the young woman and sensed her indomitable ardor. Ren looked at her friend and said that in that case, she would be happy to make a contract with her. Remy smiled and said that in that case, they would sign the contract here tomorrow. She also told the fairy not to worry, as she would bring all the necessary papers. Daya looked at Ren and said she already had a very busy schedule tomorrow, as she needed to close her first contract and set up her flower sales. The young fairy looked at her friend and said she was looking forward to it. Mamingo looked at the young fairy and called her. The young man looked at Ren and asked if she would be willing to make a contract with him as well. He smiled and said that, like Remy, a single flower would be enough for him as a reward. Mamingo said that in exchange, he would allow her to eat as much bread as she wanted from the bakery. The young fairy was delighted with the offer. Ren looked at the young man and said that this was a very pleasant condition for her. Mamingo looked at her and said with a smile that it was also very advantageous for him. He looked at her and said with a smile that, as Remy had said before, fairy flowers were worth it. After all, they were the only kind in the world. Mamingo looked intently at the young fairy and said that he really liked her flowers. He also said that he really liked the way she ate his baked bread with pleasure. The young fairy was over the moon. She said with a smile that she would definitely make a deal with him. The young man, in turn, was also very pleased. He looked at her and said that in that case, he would give her his business card. Ren took the card and was a little surprised to see the owner's name. Mamingo said the owner was a fairy, who was also a close friend of Daya's. But she was currently on a short trip, so she was absent for now. Daya looked at the young fairy and said that it would be tomorrow. She was signing 2 contracts at once. She smiled and said that it would be a good idea to go and prepare for the next day. Mamingo looked at her and asked if she would choose the bread to share with her friend. The young fairy eagerly awaited this moment. Ren brought her friend a lot of tasty things. Ren looked at Rio and said that all the food must be very tasty since she got everything from the bakery. Ren smiled and said that she could come there more often from now on. The young fairy enjoyed the exquisite food. She was very happy. The young fairy said with a smile that since they were both full, they could start studying. Ren showed her friend a language learning workbook. She looked at him and said they should start with consonants and vowels first. The young fairy gradually began to teach her friend. The young people gradually studied the workbook and all the information it contained. The young fairy was very pleased that her friend was succeeding. Ren wanted to show Rio how to write letters and how to hold a pencil correctly. The fairy looked at the notebook and the way she held the pencil with puzzlement. Ren smiled and said she should learn to hold a pencil herself. She smiled and suggested her friend just read today. Rio smiled and agreed. They studied letters and words for a while longer. The young fairy smiled and said that they had to call it a day for now. She also said that her transformation was coming to an end. The young fairy smiled and said that she wanted to show him something new. Ren showed her friend the bakery's business card. She smiled and said that's where she gets their bread. She also read the card. Ren looked at Rio and said that she met good people in this place today. Ren said they would vouch for her identity and provide her with treats and anything else she wanted. The young fairy smiled and said they were very nice people and that she would definitely introduce Rio to them someday. Ren flew closer to her friend and said she was going to sign the contract tomorrow. Rio looked at her and tried to pronounce the word contract. The young fairy looked at her friend and said with a smile that she had accomplished a lot today. She also asked him to praise her. Rio looked at her in surprise. The young fairy looked at him and told him to stroke her head with his finger. Rio immediately did as she asked. Ren smiled and thanked him. She said it gave her strength. Ren smiled and said that even though he didn't understand much, she would try her best for him. The young fairy smiled and said she wanted to show him the whole world and feed him lots of things. Rio looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he stroked her head again. The young fairy was very happy. She looked at him and told him to say that she was doing well since she had done so well. He looked at her and said with a smile that she was doing well. He also said that she would be fine. The young fairy looked at him and said that she thought it was time for her to go to bed. Rio came closer to her. Ren looked at her friend and said that she had used up all her energy today, so she wanted to go to bed early. The young fairy looked at her friend and wished him good night. Rio looked at the sleeping fairy and wished her good night as well. Moments later, they both fell asleep. The next day, a lot of people came to the bakery. One of the visitors was very impressed with the delicious cakes. Mamingo smiled and apologized for the long wait. He also said with a smile that he would help with the payment. The man smiled and said it was all right. They'd had a lot of visitors since early this morning, and he understood. The young man smiled and said he honestly thought it was all because of the flower. Those present saw a beautiful flower. They were shocked and couldn't understand where the young man had gotten such a beautiful flower. The man came closer to the flower and asked the pastry chef where they bought such a lovely flower, as he said that he also wanted to buy one. The young man smiled and said he'd be happy to tell them himself, but the flower had fallen into his hands by chance. He smiled and said he wasn't sure, but he thought they'd soon be selling flowers like that at Flora's. The young man was a little puzzled, as he was very tired. The young man looked at the young fairy and asked her how she felt about the secret observation. The young fairy smiled and said that she found it very interesting. She smiled and said his bread was very popular. The young man thanked her and said it was all thanks to her flower. He looked at her and asked if she'd noticed that everyone was asking where they could buy such a flower. He also said that everyone was praising the flower effusively for its exquisite beauty. Mamingo looked at her and said that he had said earlier that people in their region were very fond of flowers. He said that because of the dark death, as soon as the sun sets below the horizon, pitch darkness descends. Even knowing they will soon wither, people keep live plants in their homes. Plants also absorb death. The young fairy was surprised as she realized that her flowers had the power to absorb death. She was glad to have been born here as a flower fairy. A short time later, Remy came to their bakery. She greeted the young people with a smile. The young fairy was very glad that her new friend came. Ren hurried to Remy and said with a smile that she had been looking forward to seeing her. Remy was very happy. Remy looked at the fairy and said she had brought a contract with her. Remy looked at Mamingo and Ren and asked them to read the contract. The young fairy was very surprised and intrigued, as she was seeing the contract for the first time. The young man looked at it and said he didn't think it needed any revision. He asked if he could put the seal on it now. Remy said they'd put the stamp on a little later since she was planning to go to some places. It would be better to get ready and put the stamp on later. He said that in that case, he'd be preparing to sell it after noon and asked them to take the cookies. He looked at Remy and asked her to take the cookies to Flora. The young lady smiled and asked if he wanted to let her deliver them. He smiled and said he'd be in his debt. The young lady smiled and said that in that case, she'd take them right away. Remy looked at the fairy and suggested that they hurry up and settle all their affairs. The young fairy smiled and agreed. Fairy and Rami quietly left the bakery and went about their business. Remy told the fairy that she needed to make a seal first before going to Flora. The young fairy was surprised as she didn't know what a seal was. Remy said the contract required a special seal. It's the continuum seal, made from minerals. And this mineral was personally created by the fairy ruler. Remy said that if a contract is violated or unilaterally terminated, the contractor is cursed by the mineral, preventing them from creating new contracts for a long time. She said the seal is a way to ensure reliability. The young fairy looked at her friend with confusion and asked if it was okay if she didn't have any money. Remy told the young fairy not to worry, as she could afford the seal. Remy also said that the young fairy needed to have her photo taken to receive a registration card. The young fairy smiled and said it looked like she'd be busy all day today. Remy looked at the fairy with a smile and told her not to worry, as they would do everything together. The man prepared a camera for a photo. He looked at the young lady and asked her to smile naturally. The young fairy immediately followed his advice. The man looked at her and said that everything was fine and that he would take her picture soon. Ren looked at us, her companion, puzzled, and said it was the first time she'd done so many things in one day. Rami smiled and said they'd already bought a stamp and taken a photo. So, next, they needed to go meet the Flora. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked what kind of person Flora was. Remy thought for a moment. Remy said the young lady became a florist 5 years ago, opening her own shop. She's only 17 now, but she's already quite successful. Ren was puzzled, unsure if the Flora would appreciate her flowers. Remy looked at the fairy and asked how many flowers she could grow. The young fairy said that to grow all the flowers, she had to meet certain conditions. During the promotion, she had to choose the flower attribute again. She said she had to be a true professional and work hard. Remy smiled and said that even her broker mother didn't often see fairies like her. The young fairy realized that Remy's mother was a remarkable person. She looked at her companion in surprise and asked if her mother dated high-level fairies. The young lady said her mother was known as the best spiritual contract broker in the empire. She said she dreamed of one day surpassing her. Remy smiled and asked the fairy to continue to watch over her. The young fairy smiled and said she would certainly do so, asking her companion to keep an eye on her as well. Remy looked at the fairy and said that it seemed like they hadn't noticed the interesting conversation before they had already arrived at the place. The young lady and the fairy stared at the Flora flower shop. Remy walked into the store and greeted Flora. Flora stood in turn and watched the flowers intently. The young lady saw Remy and greeted her with a smile. Flora looked at Remy and asked if she'd come to reserve flowers. Remy smiled and said she'd come today to mediate. Flora was surprised, looked at her friend, and asked if she had made a contract with the florist. Remy looked at her and said she had made a contract not with the florist, but with a fairy. Flora was a little surprised. Remy looked at the fairy and asked if she could give Flora permission to see her. The young fairy smiled. You looked at the Flora and said that she wanted to introduce her to a fairy who came to the store to sell flowers. The young fairy revealed herself in all her glory and greeted Flora. She also said she was very glad to meet her. Flora was very surprised. She said that she never thought she would see such a young fairy on the street. Flora looked at the fairy and asked if she had been born from the magical drops that had recently fallen from the sky. The young fairy smiled and said that it was indeed so. The young fairy decided to pull herself together, knowing the legend had already been concocted for her. She said she had followed the fairy Daya and had come here to earn money. She smiled and told Flora that by coming to her, she could sell her flowers. Ren looked at the Flora and asked if she could extend her hand. The fairy said she wanted to give her a flower as a request to take care of her. For some time, Flora watched intently as the fairy performed her magic. Flora was very surprised, as she had never seen anything like this before. In the blink of an eye, a flower appeared in her palm. Flora was very surprised, as she realized that this was the same flower that the visitors had recently been looking for. Flora smiled and said that a crowd of customers had come into her shop today, asking where they could find a flower like that. She said she'd been wondering what kind of flower they were looking for, but now she understood everything. She said it was the kind of flower that warms the heart just by looking at it. She said the petals were soft yet vibrant, and the leaves, in turn, were round and voluminous. She said they had a charm that drew people's attention. Remy looked at Flora and said that she seemed to rate her very highly. Flora smiled and said that anyone would say the same when looking at such a beautiful flower. Flora looked at the fairy and thanked her for coming. She said she would sell her flowers and asked how many she could grow in a day. The fairy smiled and said she could currently grow about 15. Flora smiled and said they would do it this way. She said the purchase price for one flower would be 100,000 pitas. She said she would sell it at that price now, but she thought she could soon raise the price to 1,000,000 pitas. The young fairy was very happy, but also a little puzzled as she didn't know how much money it was. She hadn't figured it out yet. Remy looked at the fairy and said that was a very high price, since one slice of cake costs 10,000 pitas. The young fairy was very surprised and delighted, as she realized she could buy 10 pieces of cake for one flower. She thought she was in a dream. She thought that this was most likely a dream and she needed to wake up quickly. Flora looked at the fairy and asked if she would deal exclusively with her. She said she wanted to study her flowers inside and out. The young fairy said, puzzled, that this was very good, but unfortunately she would not be able to come often, since she could not freely leave the place where she lived. Flora looked at her and asked how she could use the communication device. She said the fairy could use it on a day when she couldn't come. Remy looked at the fairy and said it was a good idea. She asked the fairy if she wanted to buy a communicator now. The fairy smiled and said yes. The young people discussed all the details of the contract and agreed on the terms. Remy said they needed to sign the contract at the bakery. Flora agreed to the terms and they agreed to meet at the bakery sometime later. The young fairy looked at her companion and asked where they were headed. Rami said they were going to the castle administration office to get a registration card. Rami said that when a fairy applies, she enters her name, level, attribute, origin, and nominates a guarantor for her residence. Rami said she would be the guarantor for her residence. The first thing that needed to be done was to complete the paperwork as a human being. The second is a demonstration of abilities. The young fairy needed to demonstrate her abilities directly. The young man was surprised because he saw us in the flower's palm. He was struck by the flower's beauty. The young fairy was a little puzzled, seeing the expression on the young man's face. She couldn't understand why he was simply silent and saying nothing. Remy looked at the young man and apologized, asking if he could fill out the document quickly. The young man apologized hastily and said he would do it immediately. Remy looked at the fairy and said that she seemed to have impressed everyone. She also said with a smile that ever since she transformed into a human, no one had been able to take their eyes off Ren. Remy looked at the fairy and asked if she could feel people's gazes. The young fairy, confused and perplexed, said that she now understood everything, as she had previously thought she had done something wrong. Remy said that, frankly speaking, there weren't many children in their region, so everyone was keeping a close eye on Ren. The young man gave Ren a registration card. He told her to use it whenever she needed to verify her identity. The young fairy was overjoyed. It was the first time she'd seen a registration card. Rami smiled and said she could now get a library card. Remy smiled and said the fairy that if she needed her help in the future, she could contact her at any time. My fairy smiled and thanked her companion. After some time, the fairy accepted Remy's help and made a library card for the library. Later, they went into the store and bought a communicator. First, she exchanged numbers with Remy. The harlots were delighted and had a great time. They didn't even notice when the time came to sign the contract. The young fairy met with her acquaintances to sign contracts. Remy looked at the fairy and said that all that was left was to sign and put the seal. The young fairy smiled and said that she was putting a seal. Remy looked at the contract and said that she was now making it official. Remy looked at Mamingo with a smile. He, in turn, smiled too. Remy smiled and said that they were now contractors. The young fairy smiled and said that the contract was very exciting, and she, in turn, was very excited. The young people thanked the fairy and said they were very happy to sign a contract with her. Flora looked at the young fairy and said that a contract with a flower fairy was indeed a rarity. Mamingo looked at them and said that since they had signed the contract, she could take as much bread as she wanted. The young fairy was very happy and thanked the young man with a smile. Remy looked at Flora and asked if she thought Mama had become a completely different person. Flora, in turn, smiled and said that was indeed the case. Remy looked at Flora and asked when he was going to reveal his true identity to the young fairy. The young fairy smiled and told her friend everything. She said she had gone through all this in human form. She smiled and asked him what he thought. She also asked if she had done well. The fairy saw a face that expressed complete misunderstanding. Rio looked at the young fairy intently and with surprise. Ren looked at him and asked why he was looking at her with such surprise. A moment later, he rose to his feet. The young fairy was surprised and called his name. Ren looked at him and asked what had happened. She looked at him in surprise and asked if something bad had really happened. Rio approached her and asked who did it. The fairy was perplexed. The young man looked at her face and asked again who did it. The young fairy looked at him with indignation. The young man calmly and tenderly stroked her face with his hand. Rio looked at her closely and asked if it hurt. Rio kept asking who did this to her face. The young fairy smiled and said she'd done it herself. Ren said she was simply overjoyed because her flowers would sell for a very high price. The young fairy smiled and said she had hit herself slightly. She smiled and told him not to worry about it. Rio was puzzled because he knew she was in pain. The young fairy smiled. She was pleased by his concern. She looked at him and said that she promised him that if anyone hurt her, she would definitely tell him. She smiled and said she knew he was worried about her, and asked him not to worry about her. The young man agreed with her. The young fairy smiled and asked if it meant he wasn't worried anymore. Ren smiled and said that since she was in human form, they needed to practice writing letters. A moment later, she pulled out all the necessary supplies. The young fairy smiled and said they needed to start with the pencil-holding technique. The fairy smiled and said that she had had to write her name many times today when making contracts. The young fairy looked at her friend and showed him how to hold a pencil correctly. A moment later, the fairy showed her friend how to spell her name correctly. The young fairy smiled and wrote her name and her friend's name. Ren looked at Rio and asked if he wanted to try writing the name. The young fairy was surprised when Rio picked up the pencil correctly on his first try. She smiled and said she'd like to see if he could write the name correctly on the first try. The young fairy watched her friend closely. After a few minutes, she looked at his notes in surprise. Ren looked at him in surprise and said that he was doing very well. She was puzzled because he only wrote her name. Ren looked at him and asked if he liked her name. Rio smiled and said he really liked her name. The young fairy smiled and asked him to write his name down as well. The young man agreed and began writing. The young fairy was overjoyed. She was glad she'd been able to teach her friend. She looked at him and smiled and praised him. The fairy came closer to him and hugged him. She told Rio that in that case, they could read a book of fairy tales from the library now and go to bed later. The young fairy lay on her back and read a book to her friend. Ren read the book without stopping. She was very happy and cheerful. The young fairy enjoyed reading. After a few minutes of reading, Ren glanced sideways at her friend and said that he was as amazing as the baby bird in the book. Rio looked at her in surprise. The young fairy smiled and said that it seemed like he was looking only at her again. Ren looked at him and said with a smile that he was probably thinking about something else. She smiled and asked what he was thinking about. Rio looked at her puzzled and said what he thought about the contract. The young fairy looked at him and asked if he was interested in what a contract was. Ren said a contract is a promise from each of two beings, namely to give each other something of value. She said Mamingo promised to give him his food, Remy his necessities, and Flora his money. Ren said that in exchange, she promised to grow her flowers for them. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that this was very surprising, since her flowers had previously been quite valuable. Ren looked at Rio and asked what he thought about it. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked him if her flowers were important to him. Ren looked at him and said that she could give him one of her flowers. The fairy asked her friend what he could give her in return. The young man looked at her intently and said his name. She looked at him in surprise. He said he would give himself to her. The young fairy was shocked, as she hadn't expected such a thing from him. The young fairy looked at her friend and said with a smile that he embarrassed her. She also said that he was much more valuable than her flowers. The young man moved closer to her and said that she was valuable and he wanted to make a contract with her. The young fairy was utterly confused and felt as if her core was about to explode. She felt that today truly was a strange day. It felt like a dream that never ended. She thought she was truly asleep. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked what contract he wanted to make with her. Rio looked at her and said that he wanted to make a soul contract with her. The young fairy was puzzled and surprised by such a statement. She looked at Rio intently and said that the soul contract was not at all simple. Ren said that a soul contract is an imprint of each other's existence. If a person opens the door to the soul of a soul, they become a souler who can harness the power of a fairy. The souls of the person and the fairy become linked, and the person becomes a souler exclusively of that fairy. The young fairy looked intently at his friend and asked if he wanted to make a contract with her. even though she didn't have the same power as the others. Rio looked at her and said he wanted to make a contract with her. And with a smile, he asked her to make a soul contract with him. The young fairy was surprised and confused. Rio smiled and took her hand. He looked at her intently and asked her to stay with him forever. Rio repeated to her several times that he wanted her to be tired of him forever. Ren was surprised and confused, as she did not expect such words from him. The young fairy pushed her friend away and in a trembling voice said that it wouldn't work now. The young man was surprised. The young fairy told her friend that she refused to make a contract with him not because she hated him. She said it was a choice she made for his sake. A fairy mark will appear on the body of a person who has made a contract with a fairy. She said they are examined every day. And in such a situation, it will be impossible to hide the fairy mark. She said that from the note, he may face even greater difficulties than he already does. The young fairy smiled tenderly and said that she did not want to expose him to such danger. The young fairy smiled and said that instead she would promise him something. She said with a smile that he would become her first soul contractor. The boy looked at her in surprise. Ren said that since she was young, it was too difficult for her to form a soul contract yet. But when he got out and she became an adult, then the time would be right. The young fairy smiled and said that until then, she wouldn't make a soul contract with anyone. So he should wait a little. The young man smiled and said he would wait for her. The young fairy came closer to him and thanked him. The young fairy greeted Mamingo and Remy with a smile. She was very happy and told them that she had already arrived. The young man looked at the young fairy and greeted her with a smile. Remy, in turn, also greeted the young fairy with a smile. Remy looked at her friend and invited her to the table to eat cake with her. The young fairy smiled and thanked Remy. The young man looked at the fairy and asked if she had come today for the photos. The fairy smiled and said that taking photos was very interesting. Ren looked at the young people and said she really enjoyed showing her friend what she'd seen. She also said she wanted to ask them something. The young people sat there, perplexed, staring at the fairy. The fairy, puzzled, said that, frankly, she had told her friend a lot about them, but she didn't know how to properly introduce them to him. Ren looked at them and asked if she could call them her friends. Remy, for her part, was very surprised. She thought the fairy was very cute and wanted to take her home immediately. Mamingo smiled and said that, of course, she could. Remy, in turn, was very happy and also said that, of course, she could call her her friend. The young fairy was very happy. Ren looked at them, embarrassed. She realized they had been friends before. The young fairy looked at the young people and asked if, since they were already friends, they could address each other informally. The young people agreed with a smile. The young fairy joyfully thanked the young men. She also asked them with a smile to take care of her. Remy slammed her fist on the table in a fit of emotion. The young lady was shocked and couldn't understand how anyone could be such a sweet fairy. Mamingo smiled and said that if she broke the table, she'd pay for it herself. Remy looked at the young man and said he was also crazy about the young fairy. She couldn't understand why he was pretending to be so calm. The young man, puzzled, asked her why she continued to accuse him. Remy looked at him and said that it was because he didn't even like flowers. The young man looked closely at the flower and said that it was true, and he had never liked flowers. But the flower the young fairy had was special. Mamingo said the fairy was sincere and cheerful, and that's why her flowers reminded him of that. Remy smiled and said that's why her flowers looked even more beautiful. Mamingo thought it might have something to do with her secondary attribute. A fairy's attribute is divided into two parts, primary and secondary. Ren's flower represents her primary attribute. The fairy's personality and level of affection determine her secondary attribute. But still, the young man knew that the young fairy looked cute to her because of this attribute. He thought there was no connection to the attribute in the first place. It was very sad that the newly born fairy was suffering so much and trying so hard for her friend. The young fairy reminded Mamingo of someone. The young man thought that if such a child existed, he might feel the same way. Remy looked at the young man and said she thought the fairy's friend was a prisoner, locked up in the upper floors of the tower. Mamingo agreed, as the young fairy had asked about the castle's owner. Mamingo said that if he listened to her words, he was definitely locked in solitary confinement. He said the fairy had accidentally befriended a serious criminal in such a place. Remy, puzzled, said she'd heard it wasn't a place for people to live. She looked at the young man and asked what he thought about it, since he knew better than anyone. She looked at him and said he was a criminal with 8 previous convictions. The young man's expression instantly changed, and he said that the place looked like a dump. The young lady smiled and said it was true, as he had told her the other day that the bread there was tasteless. The young man said that it was because of this shock that he had started baking cookies. Remy looked at him and asked, puzzled, what kind of guys were usually in solitary confinement. Mamingo said that it was usually the very dangerous criminals who were locked up there, but they also locked up the strong. Solars. The young lady looked puzzled and said that it would be nice if this prisoner were at least a little kind. The young man glanced sideways at the young lady and said that if she was finished with her business, he would like to close the bakery. Remy looked at him in surprise and asked where he was going. She wondered if he was heading back to the field of destruction. The young man with a gloomy expression said that he was heading to the field of destruction. He looked at the young lady and said that he was going to kill all night long. The young man called his friend in confusion and told him to look the other way. They saw Sauler Heptarim Mamingo Berry. He had a Sauler rank of 7 out of 10. The young men whispered frantically. They were shocked, knowing he was one of the few who could reach the front line. The young man moved his friend, puzzled, and said that he didn't care, and also told him to get out of the way. He came closer to Mamingo and greeted him, calling him an old friend. The young man looked at Mamingo with bewilderment and said that he had no idea whether the Lidas remembered famous people like him. The young man looked at Mamingo and said that recently some very interesting rumors had been circulating about him. He said that he had recently heard that a young flower fairy had recently been born. The young man said with a grin that he had heard that Mamingo had seduced her and made a contract with her. Mamingo would like to share a few secrets with them. The young man grinned and said that he too wanted to seduce the naive fairy and make a contract with her. In the blink of an eye, a weapon was frozen at the young man's throat. Mamingo approached the young man and told him he'd better watch his mouth. He glared at the young man and told him he needed to watch his words if he didn't want to die at his hands. Mamingo looked angrily at the young man and asked who seduced whom. Everyone stared at the young men. They couldn't understand what the young man had done to make him so angry. Mamingo said. Mamingo looked at the boy and said he was being so obvious it was almost funny. He looked at him intently and asked if he thought he didn't realize the boy was using her as an excuse to start a fight. Mamingo looked at the young man and asked if his stupid head was too heavy. He could rip it off his shoulders in a second. The young man was terrified, approached Mamino and asked him to calm down and not waste his energy. He smiled and said they'd better go hunting instead. A moment later, Mamingo retrieved his weapon. He looked at the young man with disdain and told him he should be more careful not to catch his eye. Finally, Mamingo looked sideways at the young man and said that if he saw him again, he would really kill him. For a moment, the young man trembled with fear. The young man, in turn, patted Mamingo on the shoulder and said that they needed to get to the battlefield as soon as possible. The young man was glad he'd dissuaded Mamingo from committing crime, but he also knew Mamingo had a very bad temperament. But he knew he had to tolerate his character. Mamingo Berry was an experienced and skilled hunter, surpassing most hunters in strength and ability. On the battlefield in Mamingo, I encountered bloodthirsty monsters. Mamingo attacked with lightning speed and dealt heavy blows to the monsters. Everyone was shocked as Mamingo took out the huge capital with just one blow. The duels on the field are similar to each other in terms of death. A battle to exterminate and destroy a monster that reproduces itself endlessly until the true destruction, which is the core, is found. The longer the battle with Doom, the more dangerous the corrupted Doom becomes. Hunters with weak ego can be consumed by Doom. Hunters on the front lines directly confronting the capital are exposed to far greater risks than others. Because of this, they are highly sensitive to self-control. Their management methods are varied yet simple. Have plants nearby that absorb death, or have a hobby to which you devote yourself, or think about someone who calms your mind and soul. After a protracted battle, Mamingo sat on the ground and smiled silently. The young man sincerely wanted tomorrow to come sooner. Mamingo smiled and greeted the young fairy. He brought her the cake she had asked for last time. The young fairy smiled and thanked him sincerely. The young man smiled and asked why she decided to decorate the cake herself. The young fairy smiled. The young fairy said her friend had finished learning the language. Mamingo was shocked, saying it was excellent news and that the young man had mastered it very quickly. The young fairy smiled and said that it was truly amazing. They studied one book every day. The young fairy smiled and said that's why she wanted to give her friend a cake as a congratulatory gift. She also said she'd like to write a message on top. The young man smiled and said that she must really like her friend. The young fairy said that she wrote his name in chocolate and decorated the edges with her own. The young fairy wrote on the cake that she congratulated her friend and was very proud of him. She was very happy and told her friends with a smile that she had finished the cake. Flora looked at her and said they needed to wrap the cake. The young fairy smiled and said she would do so immediately. After a while, the young fairy smiled and said that she had finished packing the cake into the box. Flora looked at the young fairy and said that she thought she had dressed up because it was a special day. Flora smiled and said that this one was even cuter than her everyday look. The young fairy was surprised and asked if it was true. She said she wanted her friends to like it too. Flora looked at the fairy and, smiling, told her to convey their congratulations to her friend on his academic success. Mamingo said he hoped he'd enjoy the cake. Ren smiled and said that she would definitely pass it on. The young fairy hugged Flora and thanked them. Mamingo smiled and said he thought her friend was already waiting for her. He smiled and told her to come to him quickly. The young fairy smiled and said goodbye to them. Ren was very happy and immediately flew to meet her friend. Mamingo looked at Flora and asked how the young fairy was selling the flowers. Flora smiled and said she'd raise the price. She said the flowers were so popular that they were all sold out. The young man smiled and said that in that case, the fairy no longer had to worry about money. Flora told him not to worry, as the fairy had already earned a lot of money. Flora said that at this rate, she would soon earn a fortune. Flora was a little puzzled, as she was worried that the castle's lord himself would soon notice the young fairy. The young fairy presented her friend with a cake and congratulated him on his graduation. The young man looked at the cake in surprise. He asked if it was true that she had made the cake for him. The young fairy smiled and said that it was true, and that the cake was her gift to him. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked if he remembered what happened in the book. She said the teddy bear blew out the candles on the cake. Ren smiled and said they could do the same. The young man looked intently at the gift the fairy had given him. He looked at her and said that he was very happy and in a very good mood. The young fairy was very happy. She looked at him and asked if he would like to blow out the candles then. Ren said they needed to be blown out before they melted. She was a little taken aback as she noticed they were already starting to melt. She was shocked as she realized she was about to be ruined. Rio grabbed the candles. The young fairy was shocked and screamed at him to open his hands. The young fairy told him to give her his palm. She was shocked and didn't understand why he had grabbed the hot candles. The young fairy was puzzled because she noticed that Rio had been burned by fire. She looked at him and asked what had gotten into him. The young man said it would hurt her because the candle flame was hot and dangerous, and it would hurt if Ren grabbed the candle. Rio looked at the young fairy and said that Ren was dear to him and he didn't want her to get hurt. Ren stared at the cake, shocked, not expecting Rio to say something like that. She realized he was simply trying to protect her. The young fairy looked at her friend and asked him not to do that again. She looked at him intently and said sadly that it hurt her to see him suffer. The young man looked at her intently and asked if he had hurt her. Ren looked at him and he said she meant something else. She was shocked because she realized he had misunderstood her. The young fairy hugged her friend tightly and asked him to appreciate himself more. She smiled and said that first he needed some healing. A moment later, the young fairy used her magic and healed him. The young fairy stared at her friend. She wanted him to quickly understand that he was trapped in such a place only temporarily. She knew that he was a precious seed that could not be replaced by anything else. As a flower fairy, she had a responsibility and wanted to ensure its growth. The young fairy was a little surprised, as she hadn't expected its wounds to heal so quickly. The young fairy was surprised, as she had used her powers, but she was surprised by how quickly his wounds healed. The young fairy was briefly distracted from her thoughts when she saw Rio eating cake, and she was surprised. She asked him what he was doing. Rio looked at her puzzled and said he was eating the cake she had made him. The fairy said it was forbidden to eat food from the floor. The young man leveled himself and said her cake was delicious. The man looked intently at the boy. A moment later, he said with a grin that the mind correction was complete. The woman looked at the boy and said the only thing left to do was weaken him, since his strength was completely suppressed. The man looked at his mentor and asked if training would really begin next month. The man looked intently at those present and said that everything was correct and that they would have to report this to the boss. The man looked at the boy with a smirk and said that, in the end, his inner self had been crushed. He considered the boy a foolish rebel. The young fairy made faces. She smirked and said that they themselves were stupid. The young fairy looked at them and said that her Rio had fooled them all. The young fairy flew up to Rio and whispered in his ear that she would follow the explorers today. She said they would meet in the room a little later. The young fairy smiled and said they would see each other soon. A moment later, she flew after the people. Ren followed the people continuously. Ren knew that, according to those people, they had taken the elevator up and immediately arrived in Zone 4. She knew she needed to remember everything. The researchers who arrived in the 4th zone started a conversation during their meal that was completely inappropriate for them. The young fairy noticed that the portion of food given to Rio was completely different. She noticed that the researchers were eating fresh food and drinking warm coffee. The young fairy was shocked and couldn't believe these people were torturing Rio. Their conversations were simple, which made it even more terrifying. The young fairy was shocked and very angry as they sat and ate, and Rio was locked up. The young fairy sat intently, watching everyone. She realized the bespectacled explorer was the leader. She knew that if she could follow him, she'd learn something about Rio. Following the man, she came to the second floor of the castle. He wrote to Dominic Grayson and headed to his personal lab. The man was surprised, noticing that he had received the information about the reagents he had asked Noel for. He looked at the documents and said that the development of lycodium had finally been completed. The young fairy read in the notes that the drug made skin stronger and bulletproof. She was surprised and didn't understand what meeting they were planning to use it at. The young fairy saw additional entries. She decided to study them immediately, as she realized that there was information about her friend there. She was shocked to read that of the 20 survivors, the numbers were 6, 11, 14, and 20. These children were assigned the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 in age order. Their procedure logs were also renamed. The young fairy was shocked, realizing that besides Rio, there were other children who had been subjected to cruel experiments. She was perplexed and couldn't understand how the other children had survived. She desperately wanted to know what had happened to them. The answers to these questions were readily available on the adjacent table. The goal of this experiment was to create a being whose abilities would surpass those of humans. All the children involved in this experiment, except Rio, died long ago. Furthermore, over the past 7 years, Rio has been exposed to a highly toxic dose of drugs, causing various side effects. The young fairy now understood why the young man had superhuman abilities, as Rio had demonstrated. He had powerful regenerative abilities, and this too was a result of the drug. The young fairy was a little puzzled. She realized that the experiments had only begun being recorded 10 years ago. She realized Rio had been completely alone this whole time. She felt terrified, as Ren realized he had been imprisoned in a dark prison, subjected to cruel experiments. Ren was shocked by everything that had happened, but she still knew she shouldn't cry. She had to be strong for her friend. She knew this information was crucial, and so she had to remember it all. Ren noticed that the man was going somewhere. She decided to follow him immediately. The young fairy noticed that the higher the floor, the more luxurious the surroundings became. She was desperately curious about what was on the top floor. The man came closer to the door and introduced himself. The man asked the burgomaster if he could come in. The young fairy was surprised. She was shocked because she heard the man say, "Burgomaster." It was the lord of the Lancer's land, the castle, and the prison. The young fairy was shocked, realizing Rio's master was behind the door. The Burgo sister looked at the man and said that he could come in. He looked at the man with a fierce gaze and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young fairy looked intently at the men who were talking. Ren was shocked to see Develik in person. Musel. The young fairy watched them from afar, as she understood that the best solar had a good sense of smell, and if she came closer, he would immediately understand that she was here. She decided to move a little closer using the fata rays of movement. The man looked at the owner and said that there were no special features, and the calibration and strengthening would be completed soon. The owner looked at the man and said everything was going more smoothly than he expected, and he also asked when training would begin. The man looked at the owner and said they planned to start training in May. The owner looked at the man with a cold and fierce gaze and told him to start training immediately. The young fairy decided to come even closer. While using the fatares of transition, Ren was enveloped in the aura of origin, and all sounds and vision were blurred. But if you listen closely, you can understand what they're saying. The master looked at his subordinate and said that the ultimate goal was a candle tower in 10 years. He also said that he needed to train to be ready for battle in 4 years. The master looked at his subordinate and said that the king did not want to wait any longer than that. The man looked at the owner and said that he would do his best. The young fairy was shocked to hear that there was a king. She realized there was a man taller than Musel. The young fairy saw a lot of documents on the table and wondered if there was any useful information there for her. She saw information about the children's project Valma. She was a little confused as she didn't know what a Valma was, but she still understood that it had something to do with Rio. The young fairy flew unnoticed through the night city among the residents. The young fairy accidentally heard from young people about the Valma weapon. The man smiled and said he'd finally found a Valma weapon. His companion was shocked, saying such a weapon was simply priceless. He looked at it and asked how much he'd paid for it. The young lady was shocked to hear them talking about the Valma weapon. She didn't expect to hear such a thing on the street. The young fairy was a little puzzled, as she knew that if she listened closely, she could hear the Valma's name quite often. But she didn't know who this Valma was. Ren knew she'd better ask someone. Ren knew she needed to get the information from someone well-connected and someone who could easily find it. She realized Remy was the perfect person for the job. The young fairy flew into Remy's office. Rami was overjoyed to see the young fairy. She greeted Ren with a smile. Remy hugged the young fairy tightly and asked what she was doing in her office at such a late hour. The young fairy smiled and said she had one question. The young fairy looked at Remy and asked if she knew what a Valma weapon was. Remy said the Valma Manufactory was a weapons factory run by the Valma. The quality was the best in the universe, unmatched, and the options were excellent. Ramil said the weapons were simply exorbitantly priced, but since Valka managed the production himself, the price was quite reasonable. All the powerful weapons Valma's children used were manufactured there. The fairy looked at her companion and asked how famous Valma was. Remy looked closely at the fairy and asked if she even knew who she was. Remy said that Valma was the monarch of the fairies. Ren was shocked by this news. She didn't expect to hear such a thing. A fairy gains one new trait with each ascension. A standard fairy can only have 5 traits. There are a small number of fairies with the 6th trait. This is a small number of fairies who have conquered the Candle Tower. Having proven their strength and the superiority of their being, they acquire the final trait, transcendence. And they become the patron of the fairy. And the patron of the fairy becomes their master. Ren looked at Remy intently and said she wanted to know more about Velma. She frantically begged her friend to tell her everything she knew. Rami smiled and said she couldn't refuse, since the young fairy was asking with such sparkling eyes. Remy looked at the fairy and said she would definitely tell her everything. Velma was a male fairy, a very powerful battle fairy. He was extremely strong and enjoyed great renown throughout the universe. However, its popularity was also due to its unique nature. The young fairy was puzzled, as she didn't understand what unique nature was being referred to. Remy was a little confused and didn't know how to answer such a question correctly. Remy said that a real fairy can only have a child with a creature she loves. But Velma was different. What Velma loved wasn't a living being, but a powerful force. Remy said everyone said he only wanted power for himself and wanted an army. He slept with countless women every day, and soon many children were born. Most of the children died, unable to withstand Velma's power. But some children survived. After the children grew up into powerful solars, they began to be called Velma's children. Velma and his children challenged the Candle Tower. And finally, 200 years ago, he successfully conquered it. It was the moment of the birth of the new fairy king. Remy said that he later challenged the top floor of the Candle Tower again and failed. And then all of Velma's first children died. The young fairy was shocked, looked at her companion, and asked if, since Ace were the first children, that meant the second children too. Remy said that was true, and that Velma's story didn't end there. She said Velma had challenged the Candle Tower several more times but had failed and disappeared. Exactly 30 years later, he reappeared with other children. Remy said that there must probably be more than 100 second children of Velma. Remy said, puzzled, that there were only 8 officially confirmed children on their planet. 6 of them had died, and the other 2 were missing. Remy looked at the fairy and said she thought the missing children had been kidnapped. Everyone dreams of having a child with such power. After hearing her friend's story, Ren understood why Rio was imprisoned in a terrible prison and subjected to painful experiments. The young fairy realized that Rio was the child of the fairy lord. Ren looked at her companion and asked if the fairy monarch was still alive. Remy looked at her friend and, puzzled, said that, as far as she knew, he had passed away long ago. The young fairy was puzzled because she realized that Velma had done nothing to find Rio. Remy looked closely at her companion and asked why she was interested in such information. The young fairy hesitated and said it was simply that his weapon was very famous. Remy smiled and asked if she would be interested in examining such a thing in detail. Ren now knew that her friend was being bullied because of his terrible background. The young fairy was shocked, as she understood that Rio and the other children deserved love and kindness. Rami, in turn, was shocked, as she saw the young fairy crying. Remy looked at her and asked what happened, as she did not understand why the young fairy was crying. Remy was shocked and wanted to help the young fairy, as she couldn't bear the thought of her crying. Ren, wiping away tears, said she thought Velma's children were unhappy. She said it was the first time she'd heard such an inhumane story. Remy was puzzled, as she now understood why the young fairy had shed tears. Remy fell onto the table, confused, and said she thought she'd said something wrong, and that was why the young fairy had said it. Ren smiled and said it wasn't her fault, and apologized for crying. The young fairy flew closer to her friend and thanked her for the detailed story. Remy smiled and said the fairy had a very sweet voice. She also said that if the fairy needed any more help, she could always come to her. Ren smiled and thanked her friend. The young fairy smiled and said goodbye to her friend. Remy smiled and wished her a good journey and also told the fairy to be careful on the road. Remy stared at the departing fairy, thinking it all had to do with her friend. A young fairy flew into Dr. Dominic's laboratory. She wanted to study all the information. The young fairy found information about Velma's children. The start date was January 1st, 1968, 13 years ago. The number of children participating in the experiment was 20. By order of the test manager, a project was launched to raise Velma's children to be individuals lacking self-control in order to create a powerful weapon. The project aims to enhance abilities that match those of Velma, who specializes in regeneration, incredible strength, and combat. The young fairy was shocked to see the number of injured children. She saw that Rio was among them too. The year 690 was recorded as the main period of doom. In the 130th month, a tornado of doom engulfed the universe. Of those born in the year 690th, only one participant survived, number 20, born on the 13th day of the 13th month. He survived the blast of death energy. Therefore, strong death resistance is expected. The fairy looked at the records. She knew it was a great stroke of luck that Rio had survived, but she was a little disappointed, as she couldn't find any information about his biological mother. However, everything written in that document was related solely to the experiment on Rio. The experiment's goal was to find a more resilient and stronger child. Only 4 out of 20 survived the drug administration, and among them, Rio turned out to be the most resilient. The young man was the most suitable candidate. The young fairy flew to her friend and called him by name. "Fairy," I turned into a human and hugged my friend tightly. Ren asked him with a gentle and warm smile if he was lonely. The young man called her name in surprise. The young fairy said she wanted him to listen to something she had to say. The fairy smiled and said it was a bit long, but he should listen to her. After a while, she said with a sad smile that was all she had managed to find out for now. The fairy looked at her friend and asked if he had trouble understanding everything she had said. The young man said he understood everything. He looked at the fairy with confusion and said he was born here but had never seen his mother. Because he was a child, the witches had experimented on him. The young fairy looked at him and said he was very smart, which made her even more annoyed. She knew he wasn't the kind of child to be locked up in a place like that. The young fairy burst into tears, looked at the young man, and said that if she were a stronger fairy, she could get them out of this place. She said that this made her very angry, as she was still helpless and couldn't help him the way she wanted to. The young man looked at his girlfriend and said with a smile that she was strong, not weak. She was shocked and looked at him. The young fairy said that she couldn't even free him. Rio looked at his friend intently and said it wasn't her fault. Rio looked at the floor and said it was he who was weak, not her. So, in a trembling voice, he asked her for forgiveness. The young fairy was shocked and said it was she who should apologize, not him. The young man looked at her and said she had always been by his side. Rio said that even though Ren was weak, she gave him delicious food, taught him to write, and became his friend. Rio looked at his friend and said that she made him know he wasn't alone. The young man smiled and thanked her for that. Rio smiled and sheepishly said that he would also try to be stronger, and then they would escape from the dungeon together. The young fairy looked closely at Rio and said with a smile that this is how it will be. She said that when they escape, they will bite into a lot of tasty food. The young fairy smiled and said that she would certainly introduce him to her friends. The young fairy smiled tenderly and said that they would definitely get out of the dungeon. The young fairy knew she needed to become stronger. She knew she had to do certain things first. There were only 3 ways for a fairy to become stronger. The first way is to level up your abilities and become a high-ranking fairy. The second is to learn and apply a special breathing technique. And finally, the third is tempering the spirit. The young fairy knew that she first needed to learn the 2-step method of fatum breathing, breathing with her whole body. She knew she needed to temper her spirit, making it strong. The young fairy began playing sports. The young man saw the young fairy suddenly start doing push-ups and was very surprised. He approached her and asked her with a smile what she was doing. The young lady smiled and said with a smile that she was training to become stronger. The young man was surprised. The young fairy said it was because she wanted to become stronger, which was why she had set this goal for herself. She also said she wanted to save money, gather information, and become stronger. The young man smiled and glanced at the notes in her notebook. He looked at her and asked if she really needed to become stronger to do something. The young fairy, puzzled, replied that there was one person she wanted to defeat. The young man was surprised, as he hadn't expected to hear such a thing from her. He looked at her and asked if that was why she'd written about wanting to achieve combat rank. The young fairy smiled and said that would make her more useful in battle. The young man looked at her and asked if there were other ways to become stronger, besides strengthening the soul. That method was very difficult. The young fairy smiled and said there were several other options. He smiled and asked how about finding someone to help her with her enhancement. He said he was talking about a doom hunter who could teach her how to use weapons other than the fairy wand. Mamingo said the hunter could show her how to operate on the battlefield. The young fairy smiled and said that was a very good idea. She said that this way she would be able to learn faster and become stronger. Mamingo looked at the fairy and asked what about him. He said he was solar, Heptarim. The young fairy was very surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. Fairies breathe through pathogram, while humans breathe through solim. The more solim a solar has, the stronger they are, and its quantity is used to determine their rank. If Mamingo, who has 7 solim, was a fairy, his rank would be Bakalas upper class. The young fairy looked at her friend with surprise and joy and asked him to teach her. The young man looked at her and asked if it would be okay if she had a little trouble with him teaching her. The young fairy smiled and said it was okay. The young man looked at her intently and said that then they would start by correcting her clumsy push-ups. The young fairy was shocked by the change in the young man's face. The young man smiled and said that it was time to start. That day she saw another Mamingo. Sometime later, in the 7th Zone's training room, a man was training with Rio. The man glared at the boy and told him to dodge, and if he hit him even once, they would start all over again. Rio sat motionless on the floor. Rio has begun full training. The most difficult training sessions took place every day. Rio attacked the man, but he still lacked strength. They brought him some strange food and told him to eat it all. It was an order. The food was poor quality, and the portions kept getting bigger. Rio grew stronger every day. The young fairy kept up with him. Together, they tried to grow as much as they could until they became strong. Flowers at once. Ren smiled and said that she felt as if she were in a very beautiful flower garden. The young fairy looked at her friend and said that he had also grown well and gained muscle. Ren said that her flowers are full of terra, which means the recovery will be faster. The young fairy smiled and invited him to sit near the flowers. The young man smiled and sat down. She looked at him and asked if she'd told him about terra last time. The young man smiled and said she had. He explained that terra was the natural energy that humans and fairies receive when they breathe. Ren said it was all correct, and that terra accumulates in the lungs and transforms into very important energy when it meets a soul. She said that if it meets a fairy's soul, it becomes Vita, and if it meets a human soul, it becomes Vis. When the lungs are filled with Vis, the gates of the soul, Solim, will open wide and a person will finally become a solar. The fairy said that the most important thing is to feel the terra. You need to slowly breathe in terror mixed with the air. The young fairy was surprised, as it was impressive. With every breath the realtor took, the person in the room faded away. The young fairy was surprised, unaware of Rio's lung capacity. He absorbed terra endlessly. The transformation speed was almost instantaneous. I realized that Rio was no longer the child who was locked in the dungeon. Rio looked at his fairy and said that he thought he could open the gates of the soul. The young fairy was shocked as she realized that Rio's soul was completely filled. She looked at him and flew closer. She quietly told him to open up. "We're going to soulmate now." The young man obediently followed her command. The young fairy was shocked, as the released energy was very strong. A stream of energy through her back caught the young fairy with lightning speed. The young fairy smiled and looked at the young man. Looking intently at Rio, she said that it was simply magnificent. She smiled and said that he had now become a soul. She was surprised, as this was the first time she had felt such strong energy. The young fairy smiled and said that she knew he was talented, but it turned out that he was a genius. The young fairy, overjoyed, began to fly around him. She smiled and said that he was an outstanding soul player. Rio looked at her and thanked her with a smile for her kind words. Unlike fairies, who know about the existence of the soul from the moment they are born, humans without special means cannot know the existence of the soul. The method people choose to recognize the soul is the artificial accumulation of Vis in the lungs. By following this method repeatedly, a certain amount of Vs will accumulate in the lungs. Then the person will gain the right to open the mouth with salt. He opens the entrance to the soul and realizes the existence of the soul. Ren thought that most likely Rio's soul was not full, even when there was enough Vis in it to cause an explosion. This meant Rio's soul was enormous. She knew it was already obvious he would become the best soul player. For this, the most important thing right now is definitely Om. If there is Om, then the soul of Rio and Patagram Ren will be able to strengthen and develop. Usually, Om is obtained by hunting down a doom. But now that's impossible. The young fairy was perplexed and didn't know how to find Om. Ren knew she would still find a way to do it. She knew she had to do it for her friend. Sometime later, the young fairy gave her friend flowers, and Flora was shocked. Flora was delighted. She stared at the flowers and said they were simply marvelous. She looked at the fairy and asked if she could now grow 100 roses. The young fairy smiled and said that was indeed true. Flora smiled and praised the young fairy. She said the price for a single flower had already exceeded 1,000,000 pitas. The young fairy was shocked. She hadn't expected the price to rise so quickly. Flora looked at the young fairy and said the price had risen while she was away. Flora told the fairy that her flowers were unusually special. She said the roots absorbed death, while the flowers radiated light, and that light drove away the darkness of death. Flora knew the flowers resembled the young fairy. She smiled and said they were truly beautiful. The young fairy smiled and said she was embarrassed. Flora said more and more people were looking for her flowers after learning they truly absorbed death. Flora looked at the young fairy and said with a smile that if this continues, the young fairy will soon become rich. Remy looked at the young fairy and congratulated her on her accumulation of money. She said that from now on, the money would accumulate at a staggering rate. The young fairy smiled and thanked them for their congratulations, then said, puzzled, that she needed even more money. The young man looked at her and asked why she needed so much money, as he was sure she had bought herself everything she wanted. The young fairy said that she needed to buy a lot of them. The young people were shocked because they didn't expect to hear something like this. Remy looked at the fairy in surprise and asked if this was all for Rio. The young fairy said it was all true and that Rio was currently training to become stronger. Remy, puzzled, said she felt like Rio was the only one benefiting from everything. She looked at the young fairy and asked if he was using her. Remy said that maybe he was pretending to be weak because he wanted the fairy to do whatever he wanted. The young fairy said Rio was a very modest and kind child, and he wasn't taking advantage of her at all. Remy smiled and said she was joking. She also asked when she wanted to buy an Ohm. The young fairy said most likely next year. She wanted to give him something she'd collected herself. The young man said it would be best to make the purchase anonymously through Remy. Buying too many ohms could catch the burgomaster's eye. Remy smiled and said that nothing would happen and everything would be fine, so they could leave it to her. The young fairy smiled and told Remy that she was the best. A man entered their bakery and announced he had delivered mail. Mamingo was surprised, as he hadn't expected to receive a letter. Mamingo looked at the man and asked who the letter was from. The man said the sender was Klondaya, and the recipient was Sharensha Berryberry. Remy opened the letter. Daya asked the young fairy if she was ready for a magical dinner. She wrote that she had been very busy lately and couldn't see her. She also asked if Ren would mind if they met at her house. She also said she would introduce her to the other fairies. Daya wrote that all fairies can be trusted, and she thinks they can help the young fairy. Remy was surprised and very pleased, as she had said it would be a pleasant meeting. The young fairy was puzzled. She didn't know if she could go, as she didn't quite fit in. Remy looked at the young fairy and said that of course it was possible, as it was a very good chance to make more connections. She looked at the young fairy and said that she hadn't seen any other fairies besides Daya, but the young fairy still decided to go to the meeting. We have romance.